Alright, settle in. You think you're safe in your home, in a store, on your way to school. But sometimes, evil shows up exactly where it shouldn't. These aren't made-up tales. They happened to real people. This is the first story. In 2022, I moved into my first apartment by myself. It was a dingy, cheap one-bedroom on the third floor of an old, run-down building in a transitional neighborhood of Philadelphia. The rent was impossibly low, which should have been my first red flag. The place had a weird vibe from the start. The air was always heavy and still, and there were strange, faint stains on the cheap beige carpet that I tried my best to ignore. About a month after I moved in, I was trying to install some shelves on the wall in my closet. As I was drilling a hole, the drill bit suddenly punched through the drywall with no resistance. I had hit a hollow spot. Curious, I poked my finger into the hole. It was a small cavity in the wall. I used a utility knife to cut away a larger square of drywall to see what was inside. Tucked away in the dark space between the wall studs was a dusty, old shoebox. My heart started to beat a little faster. I pulled it out. It was a Nike box, probably from the 1990s. Inside, there were about a dozen old cassette tapes. Each one was neatly labeled with a date, starting in the spring of 1998 and ending in the fall of that same year. I didn't have a cassette player, but the discovery was too intriguing to ignore. I went to a thrift store the next day and bought a cheap old Walkman for $5. That night, I sat on my floor, put on a pair of headphones, and pressed play on the first tape. The tape started with about a minute of silence. Then a man's voice, quiet and shaky, began to speak. April 12, 1998, he said. He's doing it again. The man, who I assumed was the tenant who lived here before me, went on to describe a sound he kept hearing. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the wall of the bedroom. He said it only happened late at night, and that it was so faint, he thought he was imagining it at first. The rest of the tape was just a low hiss of the recording, with the man occasionally whispering, "There it is. Can you hear it?" I listened to the next tape. A few weeks had passed. The man's voice was more strained, more fearful. The tapping had gotten louder, more insistent. He described how it was starting to affect his sleep, how he was becoming paranoid. He said he had knocked on his neighbors' doors, but they all said they hadn't heard anything. As I listened through the tapes, I was listening to this man's slow descent into madness. His voice became more and more frantic. He started describing other things. A cold spot in the corner of the living room. The feeling of being watched when he was alone. Objects moving on their own. A book falling off a shelf. A door creaking open. He sounded terrified and utterly alone. The last tape was dated October 3rd, 1998. The man's voice was barely a whisper. He sounded defeated. He said the tapping had stopped, but something else had started. He described waking up in the middle of the night to find the bedroom door, which he always locked, wide open. He described seeing a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just watching him. He said he couldn't move, couldn't scream. He was paralyzed with fear. The tape ended with him sobbing quietly. "I have to get out of here," he whispered. "I have to get out before it gets me too." Then the tape cut off. I sat there in the dark, my blood running cold. I had been living in the apartment for a month. I had noticed the cold spot in the living room. I had woken up a few times to find my bedroom door slightly ajar, even though I knew I had closed it. I had brushed it all off as my imagination, as the quirks of an old building. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building making me jump. Around 3 a.m. I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the wall right next to my head. I broke my lease and moved out the next week. I lost my security deposit, but I didn't care. I left a shoebox with the tapes in the wall for the next tenant to find. I sometimes wonder if they ever found them, and if they stayed long enough to hear the tapping. When I was in college, I went through a phase where I was really into solo hiking. I loved the feeling of being completely alone in nature, with just the sound of the wind in the trees and my own footsteps on the trail. I was about 19, and I felt invincible. One weekend in the fall of 2018, I decided to tackle a trail I'd been wanting to do for a while. It was a moderately difficult 10-mile loop in a state forest in southern Indiana, known for its beautiful ravines and dense woods. I packed my day pack with water, snacks, and a map, and drove out there early on a Saturday morning. The parking lot was mostly empty, which I was happy about. I wanted solitude. I started my hike, and for the first few hours, it was perfect. The trail was well marked, the air was crisp and cool, and I didn't see another soul. Around lunchtime, I stopped at a scenic overlook to eat a sandwich. As I was packing up my trash, a man came hiking up the trail from the direction I had just come. He looked to be in his late 50s or early 60s, with a wiry frame, a weathered face, and a big, bushy gray beard. He was wearing old, worn-out hiking gear and carrying a simple wooden walking stick. He looked like a seasoned outdoorsman. He stopped at the overlook and nodded at me. "Beautiful day for it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. We made some small talk about the trail conditions and the weather. He told me his name was Bill and that he hiked these trails almost every day. He seemed friendly enough, just a lonely old guy who enjoyed the woods as much as I did. He pointed with his walking stick to a barely visible path leading away from the main trail. "If you want to see something really special," he said, "the best waterfall in the whole park is down that way. It's not on the maps. The Park Service doesn't want too many people trampling it." I was intrigued. A secret waterfall sounded amazing. I asked him if it was hard to find. "Not at all," he said with a smile. "Just follow that path for about a half a mile. You can't miss it. Well, enjoy your hike." And with that, he continued on down the main trail, disappearing around a bend. I thought about it for a minute. The secret trail looked overgrown and a little sketchy, but the promise of a hidden waterfall was too tempting. I checked my map, got my bearings, and figured I could handle a short detour. I stepped off the main trail and onto the small, unmarked path. The path was much rougher than the main trail. It was narrow and steep, and I had to scramble over fallen logs and push through thick brush. After walking for what felt like much longer than half a mile, I started to get a little nervous. There was no sound of a waterfall, just the dead silence of the deep woods. I was starting to think the old man had been mistaken, or maybe he was just crazy. I decided to turn back. As I turned around, I saw him. Bill. He was standing about 20 feet down the path behind me, leaning on his walking stick, just watching me. He hadn't made a sound. A jolt of fear shot through me. "I thought you kept going on the main trail," I called out, my voice a little shaky. He just smiled that same friendly smile. "Changed my mind," he said. "Wanted to make sure you didn't get lost." His presence there, so suddenly and silently, felt all wrong. My internal alarm bells were screaming. "I think I'm just going to head back," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's getting late." "Nonsense," he said, taking a step closer. "The waterfall is just a little further. You've come all this way. It would be a shame to miss it." His voice was still friendly, but his eyes were cold and hard. I knew then that I was in serious trouble. I was miles from the parking lot, on an unmarked trail, completely alone with this man. There was no waterfall. The trail was a trap. "No, really, I have to go," I said firmly, and I started to walk past him, back the way I came. He stepped in front of me, blocking the narrow path. "I don't think so," he said, his voice dropping the friendly pretense. He raised his heavy wooden walking stick slightly. I didn't think, I just reacted. I shoved him, hard, with both hands. He was wiry, but he was old, and the push caught him off guard. He stumbled backwards, tripping over a root, and fell to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, scrambling back up the treacherous path, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't dare look back. I could hear him shouting behind me, angry, guttural yells that echoed through the silent woods. I finally burst back onto the main trail, and I didn't stop running. I ran the entire 5 miles back to the parking lot, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. When I got back to my car, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. I called the park ranger's office and told them what happened. They sent a ranger out to look for him, but they never found him. They told me they had no record of a volunteer or employee named Bill, and that there was no secret waterfall in that area of the park. I was just another stupid kid who had wandered off the trail. But I know what happened. I know that man led me out there on purpose. I don't know what he was planning to do to me in those deep, silent woods, but I know I am incredibly lucky to be alive. I haven't been hiking alone since. My mom was married to a guy named Wayne for 6 years, from the time I was about 9 until I was 15. He was a pretty cool guy at first, or at least he put on a good act. But shortly after they got married, his true colors started to show. He was a serious control freak and a bully. He treated my younger brother and me like we were annoyances he had to tolerate, but he treated his own son from a previous marriage like a prince who could do no wrong. He created a tense, unhappy environment in our house in our small Michigan town, and my teenage years were mostly spent trying to stay out of his way. I have a collection of creepy memories of him, little moments that, when pieced together, paint a very ugly picture. One of the weirdest happened when I was about 16. We were driving home from somewhere, just the two of us in his pickup truck. For some reason, the conversation turned to one of my mom's best friends, who had been a stripper in her 20s. Wayne started talking about it, and then he turned to me, a smirk on his face. "You know," he said, "I'd be cool with you being a stripper. They make pretty good money." I just sat there in silence, staring out the window, a cold, slimy feeling crawling up my spine. I was 16 years old. He was my stepdad. The comment was so wildly inappropriate, so far over the line, that I didn't even know how to respond. It was just one of those things you try to forget. Another piece of evidence that the man my mom had married was a total creep. But the worst incident, the one that really showed what a manipulative jerk he was, happened a few months later. He went out drinking with his buddies one night and came home completely blackout drunk. The next morning, my mom and I noticed that his truck wasn't parked where he had left it the night before. It was parked crooked, halfway on the lawn. My mom went out to move it and came back inside, her face like a thundercloud. She was holding a pair of lacy pink panties. She'd found them on the passenger seat of his truck. Wayne, who was nursing a massive hangover on the couch, had the audacity to blame me. He sat up, pointed a shaky finger in my direction, and started yelling that they must be mine, that I must have taken his truck out for a joyride with some guy the night before. The accusation was so insane it was almost laughable. First of all, I was 16, going on 17, and I didn't have my license yet. Second, his truck was a stick shift, and I had no idea how to drive one. Third, our bedrooms were on the second floor, and he had slept on the living room couch that night, right by the front door. There was no way I could have snuck out without him hearing me. And finally, even if all of that were somehow possible, why in the hell would I take my underwear off in his truck and then just leave them there? The logic was so flawed, so completely nonsensical, that it was obvious he was just desperately trying to deflect the blame from himself. He was caught, he knew it, and his only defense was to attack me, his 16-year-old stepdaughter. My mom, to her credit, didn't buy it for a second. It was the beginning of the end for them. Their relationship was already strained, but that incident, his willingness to throw me under the bus with such a disgusting and ridiculous lie, was something she couldn't forgive. It took her a few more months to finally leave him, but that day was the point of no return. It was a perfect, ugly example of the kind of man he was: a bully, a liar, and a creep. After I graduated high school, I started babysitting to make some extra money for college. I love kids, and I've always been good with them, so it seemed like a perfect fit. But I seemed to have the worst luck picking families. There was the creepy dad who was suddenly working from home a lot more often, and the mom who fired me in a rambling, angry voicemail over a lie her kid told her. But the worst by far was the last family I ever worked for. I only lasted 4 days. I found the family through an ad I placed on a local community website. They needed a sitter for a month to help with the transition, as the father, who had been out of work for a year recovering from a serious illness, was finally returning to his job. They said if it worked out, the position could become full-time. When I went to meet them, they seemed like a dream family. It was a beautiful, sterile, new build house in a gated community on the outskirts of Phoenix. The mom and dad were both kind and welcoming. They had 2 boys, a 3-year-old named Sam and a 5-year-old named Noah. Sam was shy and adorable, hiding behind his mom's leg. Noah seemed like a typical high-energy, look at me kind of kid. I was so wrong. I accepted the job happily. The schedule was great. I would have just the younger boy, Sam, for a few hours in the morning while Noah was at preschool. Then I'd spend the afternoon with both of them. My mornings with Sam were wonderful. He warmed up to me quickly, and we would do crafts, build massive Lego towers, and read books. He was a sweet, gentle little soul. Then there was Noah. Noah had that classic older brother attitude. I'm in charge. Pay attention to me. Not him kind of vibe. I was used to that, but there was something else going on with him. He'd get frustrated incredibly easily, and his frustration would flash into white-hot anger in a split second. If the glitter wasn't cooperating for our art project, he'd slam his fists on the table so hard the whole thing would jump. If his Lego creation fell apart, he'd let out a guttural scream of rage. I realized I had to be very calm and patient with him, but even the slightest thing would set him off. The parents had gotten the kids one of those toy sets where you can design your own cookies, with little chocolate molds and sprinkles. It was a fun idea, but Noah didn't want his younger brother interfering. When Sam reached for a sprinkle, Noah got so angry, he said something incredibly cruel to his brother. As a consequence, I calmly told him he needed to go to his room for a timeout. This did not go well. He stomped up the stairs, but then just came right back out and sat at the top of the stairs, glaring down at me. I went back up. Noah, you need to stay in your room for a few minutes because you're not listening, I said, keeping my voice even. I closed his bedroom door. He just opened it right back up. Realizing that I wasn't backing down, he started screaming. It was a horrifying, blood-curdling scream full of genuine rage. He then picked up his plastic toy box and threw it at me with all his might. It missed me and shattered against the wall. He immediately burst into tears, wailing that his dad was going to be mad at him for breaking the box. I managed to calm him down, fix the box with some tape, and talk to him about not throwing things. He apologized, and I didn't make him stay in his room any longer. But this became the pattern. Every single time he got in trouble, it was a massive, dramatic ordeal that bounced between screaming rage and ignoring my instructions completely. The third time I had to send him to his room, he refused to cooperate at all. He just kept coming out and screaming at me. I was standing on the stairs, trying to reason with him, when he realized his screaming wasn't working, so he escalated. He started yelling that he was going to bang his head against the wall until he bled. He shouted that he would hurt himself. It came out of nowhere. I had no idea where a 5-year-old even gets an idea like that. He was halfway down the stairs, and he started doing it, slamming the back of his head against the drywall. I had to run down and physically grab him to stop him. He fought me, screaming and flailing. I had been talking to his mom about his outbursts, and she just said he was in counseling, but that they didn't have a good doctor, so she wasn't very helpful. After the headbanging incident, I was at my wit's end. I had to text her to ask what I should do, and she told me to just grab him and hold him tight until he calmed down, a technique for overstimulated children. So I had to chase this screaming 5-year-old down, grab him in a bear hug with his feet off the ground, and hold him while he fought and kicked until he finally went limp and started crying. It was horrible. I was starting to understand that this kid had major, serious issues, but I didn't want to give up on the family. They had been through a lot with the dad's illness, and I loved my mornings with little Sam. When the mom checked in to see if I was still okay with the job, I said yes. Then she asked me, in a low voice, not to tell the father about the severity of Noah's meltdowns. I didn't know why. I just thought, it's their business, not mine. The next day, as soon as Noah got home from preschool, we had another meltdown. But this time, it escalated to a new, terrifying level. I was completely filled with dread as he stood in the middle of the living room, his face red and contorted with rage, and screamed, "I'm going to cut your head off." I had no idea where this was coming from. The kid was 5 years old. He continued with these threats about stabbing me, about hurting me, and then hurting himself. I was getting scared of a child. During one meltdown, I was chasing after him, and he thought it was a game. He ran into the kitchen, and I heard him drag a chair across the floor. He yelled from the kitchen, "I'm getting a knife to cut your head off." The world stopped for a second. I have never been more afraid in my entire life. I ran into the kitchen and saw him on the chair, his small hand reaching for the knife block on the counter. I had to grab him, and after I calmed him down, I hid all of the knives on top of the refrigerator where he couldn't reach them. Later that afternoon, he grabbed a pair of children's safety scissors and said he was going to stab himself, making jabbing motions at his own stomach. Then he turned and ran after me, saying he was going to cut my head off with them. All of this would be over something as simple as me telling him we couldn't go to the park until after snack time. He would go from a sweet kid doing a puzzle to a psychopathic child trying to grab weapons in a matter of seconds. By the end of that day, I couldn't bear the thought of going back. I got home and told my own mom what had happened, and she confirmed what I already knew. I couldn't go back there. It wasn't safe. I offered to finish out the week, but thank God, the family told me not to bother. The dad was angry that I had quit with no notice because he apparently had no idea his child was this disturbed. I didn't care. That child gave me nightmares. It's been a few years now, and I still wonder what happened to them. I hope Noah got the help he so desperately needed. I worry about his younger brother, and I worry that if they didn't get him help, with him acting like that at 5 years old, I'll eventually see his face on the news one day. I really, really hope I'm wrong. This happened when I was about 4 years old, so my memory is a bit fuzzy. But the story has been retold so many times in my family that the details are burned into my brain. It's not overtly terrifying, but it certainly contributed to the deep-seated fear of strange men that my mother carefully instilled in me throughout my childhood. Back in the early 2000s, there was a company in our neighborhood that was basically like a door-to-door frozen food service. They drive a refrigerated truck around and sell frozen meals, steaks, and other meats at relatively cheap prices. Our neighborhood was full of young families and elderly people, so this service was incredibly popular. My mom, who was always busy with my twin sister and me, was a regular customer. A few different delivery people worked our route, and I remember them pretty well. My sister and I were friendly, outgoing kids, and we'd always rush to the door whenever someone came by. There was a kind but no-nonsense woman who just wanted to get her job done, a sweet young man who absolutely adored our little terrier. And then there was a man, probably in his 40s, who was extremely outgoing and talkative. We'll call him the creepy delivery guy, or CDG for short. On the surface, CDG seemed perfectly normal. He was clean-shaven, well-spoken, and loved to talk endlessly about his daughter, who was supposedly about our age. He would spend minutes at our doorstep, telling my sister and me all about her while my mom wrote out a check. Even so, my mom always said she got a weird, uneasy feeling from him, but she dismissed it because he hadn't actually done anything to warrant any real concern. After a few visits to our neighborhood, he asked my mother if he could use our restroom. He was very polite about it, explaining that his shift had been long and there weren't many public restrooms on his route. My mom, being too polite to say no, hesitantly agreed. He thanked her and went inside. She noted that he was in the bathroom for an abnormally long time. When he finally came out, He gave us our order and left. After that day, the shifts no longer seemed to alternate. It was always CDG who delivered to our neighborhood. And every single time he came to our house, he would request to use the restroom. Eventually, he stopped even bothering to give an explanation. He would just ask as if it were part of the transaction. And every single time, he would take an unusually long time in there. For my mom, the feelings of discomfort were intensifying, but she was just too polite and non-confrontational to refuse him. The turning point, however, came one afternoon while he was standing in our kitchen, waiting for my mom to find her checkbook. He started telling my mom a story about how his daughter had recently gotten a bad infection in her private area. He explained in graphic detail that it was because she hadn't wiped herself properly after going to the bathroom, and that he had discovered she was wiping from back to front. Then, he turned away from my mom and looked directly at my sister and me, a wide, unnerving smile spreading across his face. Still talking to my mom, but looking at us, he requested that he be allowed to take us into the bathroom and show us the proper way to wipe, so that what happened to his daughter wouldn't happen to us. My mom was in complete and utter shock. She just stared at him, speechless. She finally found her voice and told him no, absolutely not, and that it was time for him to leave. After that incident, she never answered the door when he came around again. Whenever we saw his truck driving through our neighborhood, he would slow down as he passed our house and glare at us. A few weeks later, my mom was talking to another mother in the neighborhood and found out that he had been fired. Through the neighborhood gossip chain, she eventually discovered the most disturbing detail of all. The man was unmarried and didn't have any children. Back in the mid-2000s, maybe 2006 or 2007, the idea of having a pen pal seemed like the coolest thing in the world to me. I was 8 years old, and it felt like every character in the books I read and the TV shows I watched had one. They'd write these long, detailed letters to a friend in a faraway land. I remember watching an episode of some teen drama where a girl met up with her French pen pal, who turned out to be a creepy middle-aged man who tried to kidnap her. You'd think that would have scared me off, but apparently it did not. I was determined to find a pen pal of my own. So, I did what any tech-illiterate 8-year-old would do. I went to the family computer, logged onto AOL, and typed pen pals for kids into the search bar. I clicked on one of the first sites that popped up. It was a simple, brightly colored website with a list of children's names, their ages, their home countries, a short bio, and an email address. I scrolled through the page, looking for someone my age, but I couldn't find any other 8-year-olds. The youngest girl listed was named Lottie. She was 12 and lived in Amsterdam. I clicked on her email address and, using my mom's email account, I typed out a very cheerful and earnest message. I told her I was from the UK, that I was only 8 but was really mature for my age, and I begged her to please be my pen pal. I remember being so excited when she responded just a few hours later. She said that it didn't matter that I was only 8. In fact, she wrote, "I like younger girls better anyway." In retrospect, that is a horrifically creepy thing for a 12-year-old girl to say, but I was 8 and incredibly naive. I was just thrilled to have a new friend. And so, a friendship began. We would email back and forth almost every day. I told her everything. I told her about my annoying friends at school, about my parents fighting, about my love for Jacqueline Wilson books and Doctor Who. I basically spilled my entire life story to this stranger on the internet. Like the complete idiot I was, I told her the county I lived in, and even the specific town. I never gave her my exact address, but I did something just as stupid. I sent her a picture of myself. It was a school photo, complete with a goofy, toothy grin. She never sent a picture of herself back, and I didn't think to ask. Why would I? I trusted her. She replied to my photo by telling me I was really pretty. I remember a few things from our conversations that seem so strange now. One thing I remember vividly is that she said she really liked my eyes. My older sister, who was only a year older than me, was the only person who knew about Lottie. One day, she told me that she wasn't comfortable with it anymore, that something felt off. I, thinking I knew better, just brushed her off. But she was persistent and begged me to tell our mom. I didn't want to, but a small nagging feeling in my gut told me I probably should. That evening, I told my mom. I put on my most persuasive voice, trying to convince her that Lottie was super cool and nice, and that it was totally fine. But my mom is a very protective person, and her parental alarm bells started ringing immediately. She asked to see the emails. As she read through them, her expression grew more and more concerned. When she was done, she turned to me and said, in a very serious voice, "Honey, Lottie isn't a 12-year-old girl. I think this is a man." My mom pointed things out that I had never noticed. She pointed to the typing style, which was too formal, and the email address itself. It wasn't something simple like lottie123@hotmail.com. It was a weird jumble of letters and numbers that, according to my mom, looked more like a business email than something a kid would have. She also pointed out that the writing style had changed over the few weeks we've been talking. It had gone from normal, simple sentences to typing words with a strange mix of random upper and lowercase letters, like, "I hope you are having a great day." It just didn't feel right to her. She told me to stop emailing Lottie immediately. I lied and said I would. Of course, I carried on, but I was a little unnerved now. In my next email to Lottie, I told her that my mom wanted to talk to her mom and asked for her mom's email address. Lottie's reply was evasive. She started asking a lot of questions, like why my mom wanted to talk to hers and if I was in trouble. Eventually, after I pushed, she gave me an email address. I was relieved. In hindsight, I should have wondered why she was so reluctant. A little part of me must have realized something was wrong, because in my next email, I asked her for a photo of herself and another one with her mom. Again, she questioned me. "Why do you need a photo? Is something wrong?" I just told her my mom wanted to know what she looked like. There was no reply for a few days. I thought maybe I had scared her off. But then, finally, an email from her arrived in my inbox. Attached were 2 pictures, one of her and one of her with her mom. But they didn't look right. They didn't look like normal family photos. They looked polished and professional, like headshots for an actor. By this point, the unsettling feeling was too much for me to ignore. I'm not good at confrontation, and even to this day, I can't calmly and slowly end a friendship. I do it all at once. I replied to the email with the pictures and wrote a short, blunt message telling her that I knew she was lying and that I never wanted to speak to her again. Lottie did not take it well. The reply that came back was filled with hate. She told me she hated me, that I was ugly, and a stream of other nasty things. But what really, truly freaked me out was the last line of the email. She wrote, "I will make you as miserable as you have made me." If I wasn't scared before, I was absolutely crapping myself then. I ran crying to my mom and confessed everything. She was angry that I had lied to her, but she was also incredibly worried. She banned me from using the internet for a few weeks, which was as much a punishment as it was a protective measure. Nothing happened after that. For a while, I started to think that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe Lottie was real and I had just hurt her feelings. It was about a year later, when I was watching TV, that the truth finally came out. I stumbled upon a new Australian TV show called Mortified. And there, on the screen, was the lead actress, Marnie Kennedy. It was her. The photos Lottie had sent me were her professional headshots. So, to Lottie, or whoever you really are, I am so glad we never met. You have to remember what it was like in the weeks right after. September 11th, 2001. I was living in a small town in North Carolina, and the whole country was gripped by this weird mix of patriotism and paranoia. There's a huge army base about an hour from my hometown, so the military presence was always felt, but after 9/11s, it was dialed up to 11. Nearly every car had an American flag sticker, and a scary number of people seemed to think that anyone with skin darker than a paper bag was a potential terrorist. Everyone was on high alert. People were super vigilant, which often just meant they became overly interested in their neighbors' lives. Sometimes out of concern, but mostly out of fear. I was 8 years old at the time. My older brother and I walked to school every day. Our neighborhood even had a paved walking trail that cut through the woods and led directly to our elementary school. For some reason that week, I can't remember if it was because recent rain had flooded the creek beside the trail or if the bugs were just really bad. My brother and I decided to take a different route and walk along the road instead. This went fine for a few days. Then, one afternoon, as we were walking home, a big, black SUV with heavily tinted windows slowed to a crawl beside us. It had two of those giant American flags mounted on poles, blocking the entire back windshield. The driver's side window rolled down and a woman leaned out. She was blonde, maybe in her 40s, and wore huge dark sunglasses that covered most of her face. "It's not safe for you to be walking out here," she called out to us. My brother, who was 10, responded politely, "It's fine. We always walk home. We don't live far." That was a mistake. She rolled up her window and drove a few feet ahead, then screeched her tires to a halt. She slammed the car into reverse, backing up rapidly until she was right next to us again. She rolled down her window, and her voice was no longer friendly. It was a yell. "You spit on my car! I know you did! You spit on my car, and you need to get in right now so I can drive you home to your parents, and you can apologize in front of them." I looked at my brother, confused and scared. We both shook our heads no. "I didn't spit on your car," I called back, my voice trembling. "Get in my car right now so I can take you home." She screamed, her face red and contorted with rage. I looked at my brother again. Without saying a word, we both turned and bolted. We ran off the road and into the woods that lined the street. My heart was pounding in my chest. I heard her car door open and slam shut, and that just made me run faster. I never looked back. We just kept running, weaving through the trees, cutting through backyards, taking a long roundabout path until we finally circled back to our own street and ran into our house. We were scared, but as kids, we just sort of shrugged it off as a really weird, crazy lady. It wasn't until I was in college, maybe 15 years later, that I told the story to a friend. Their eyes grew wide. "She was trying to kidnap you," they said. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It's haunted me ever since. Her lie was so specific and aggressive. Her rage was so immediate. She wasn't a concerned citizen. She was a predator, and we were her targets. We were just lucky we were fast enough to get away. Through junior high and high school, my best friend was a guy named Marcus. I'm a female, but that never mattered. We were completely platonic and did everything together. He was the kind of friend you could call at 3 a.m. for any reason at all. Marcus had a bit of a troubled life, nothing too extreme, just a rocky home situation and a tendency to get into minor trouble. After we graduated high school, my life took a nosedive. My mom started dating a really emotionally abusive guy, and the stress of living in that environment caused me so much anxiety that I became physically ill. I was bedridden for the better part of a year, dealing with chronic pain and fatigue. During that time, I lost touch with a lot of my friends, but I tried to keep in touch with Marcus. While I was sick, he had met a girl, fallen head over heels in love, and moved in with her. Just normal life stuff. One night, my phone rang. It was Marcus. He was drunk and slurring his words. He told me his girlfriend had broken up with him and that he was going to kill himself. He said he was lying in the middle of a road somewhere with a gun to his head and was about to pull the trigger. I was terrified. I begged him to go inside, to calm down. I did call the police, but I had no idea where he was, so they couldn't do anything. I ended up calling a suicide hotline and having them call him. I don't remember all the details of that night, but I know I talked to him for hours and he didn't go through with it. Fast forward a few years. It's around 2017. I'm finally healthy again, and Marcus seems to have his life together. He's back with a new girlfriend and they have a young son. We reconnected, and I met his new family. Everything seemed great. Then, one night, I get another one of those calls. It's Marcus, drunk again. He told me that he and his girlfriend had a massive fight, and she kicked him out of the house. He said he'd been living in his work truck at his construction shop for the past few days. I felt awful for him. I was living on my own at the time, in a small one-bedroom apartment. I told him he could crash on my couch for a few days, just until things settled down with his girlfriend and he could find a place. Honestly, before this, I never would have thought he could be a danger to me. I had known him for over a decade. He was like a brother. He stayed at my place for a couple of days. One afternoon, I was super hungover from a night out with some friends. I just wanted to be left alone in my room with the blinds drawn, not talking to anyone. He knocked on my bedroom door, and I told him to come in. He came in and immediately started accusing me of being depressed. "You need to talk to someone, Sarah," he said, his voice overly serious. "You're clearly not okay." I politely told him that I wasn't depressed. I was just hungover, and that even if I did need to talk, now was not the time. But he wouldn't let it go. He kept insisting, getting more and more agitated. The conversation escalated so quickly, I didn't even see it coming. Suddenly, he lunged at me and wrapped me in a bear hug so tight I couldn't breathe or move my arms. He was squeezing me, saying, "Just let it out. Talk to me." I started panicking. I was begging him to let me go, but he just held on tighter. "I'm not letting go until you talk to me," he said, his voice strained. I finally managed to wriggle one arm free, and, with all my strength, I shoved him away from me. I scrambled out of my room, pushing him out behind me, and slammed my bedroom door, locking it. He immediately started picking the lock. I could hear the scraping of metal. A few seconds later, the lock clicked and the door swung open. He came back into the room and started forcefully grabbing me again, his fingers digging into my arm so hard that it hurt. I screamed at him to get out. I managed to break free again and ran out of my apartment. I got halfway down the hall before I realized I had forgotten my keys and my phone. I ran back inside to grab them, but he was waiting for me in the living room. He cornered me against the wall, blocking my escape. "You're not leaving until you tell me what's wrong," he said, his face inches from mine. At this point, I was shaking and bawling my eyes out, just begging him to let me go. I don't know how, but I eventually managed to slip past him. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door and ran out of my apartment, not even stopping to put on shoes. I got in my car and drove to my friend's place. As soon as I got there, I sent him a text. "Get out of my apartment right now or I'm calling the police. Leave the spare key on the counter." Later that night, my friend's boyfriend escorted me back to my apartment. He went in first to make sure Marcus was gone and that he had left a key. The apartment was empty. The next day, I looked in the mirror and saw that my arms and shoulders were covered in dark purple bruises from where he had grabbed me. I gave it a few weeks for both of us to cool down. Then I called him, trying to explain to him how what he did was completely wrong and unacceptable. He didn't see it that way. He genuinely believed he had done the right thing, that he was helping me. He showed no remorse at all. After that call, I blocked his number, blocked him on all social media, and I haven't spoken to him since. It's terrifying to realize that someone you've known and trusted for years can be a completely different person than you thought. I grew up in a small, sleepy town in Northern California, the kind of place nestled between rolling hills and farmland where everybody knew each other, or at least knew each other's faces. It was 2008, and I was 8 years old. Our family was one of the few Asian families in town, and we definitely stood out. I had 3 older siblings, and our daily ritual was to walk to and from school together in a noisy, protective pack. It was our routine, and I never really thought about it. I remember this one particular day was brutally hot. The kind of dry, oppressive heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the air feel thick in your lungs. For some reason I can't recall anymore, I was walking home from school by myself. It was highly unusual. Maybe my siblings had an after-school activity, or maybe I'd been held back for a few minutes by my teacher. Whatever the reason, I was alone. Our house wasn't too far from the elementary school, but to save time, we always took a series of back alley routes that we had mapped out, our own personal shortcuts. This one particular route cut behind a block of old houses, most of which were vacant or boarded up. The yards were overgrown, and the street was cracked and uneven. It was usually completely silent and deserted, a ghost street where you'd rarely even see a car. I remember thinking about how heavy my backpack felt and how the sun was beating down on the back of my neck. All I wanted was to get home to the air conditioning and a cold glass of water. I was about halfway down this quiet, empty street when I heard it. The low, gravelly crunch of tires rolling slowly on the pavement behind me. It was so quiet on that street that the sound was jarring. I didn't think much of it at first and just kept walking. But the sound didn't go away. The car wasn't passing me. It was matching my pace, staying about 20 feet behind me, crawling along. A prickle of unease started on my neck. I was a shy, anxious kid by nature, and this was weird. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just someone looking for a house address. I kept my head down and walked a little faster. The car sped up to match me. I slowed down. The car slowed down. After what felt like an eternity of this slow, awkward dance, my curiosity and fear got the better of me. I glanced over my shoulder. It was a small, beat-up black sedan, maybe an old Honda or Toyota, with tinted windows. I could just make out the silhouettes of at least 2, maybe 3 people inside. My first thought was that it was a prank. When we first moved to town, some of the older kids would tease us for being different. I thought maybe it was them trying to spook me. I was starting to feel really uncomfortable. I decided to stop walking altogether. I stepped off the road and onto the dry, cracked dirt shoulder, turning to face the car, trying to make it clear that they could just pass me. I still didn't feel like I was in real danger. This was our town. It was safe. Bad things didn't happen here. The car rolled slowly to a stop right beside me. The passenger side window hummed down with a squeal. There were 3 young men in the car. They weren't teenagers. They looked to be in their early 20s. I remember being struck by the fact that I didn't recognize any of them. In a town this small, there was a strange and unsettling feeling. The man in the passenger seat leaned over, a wide, friendly-looking smile on his face. "Hey there," he said, his voice smooth. "You need a ride? It's pretty hot out." His offer was so tempting. The sun was relentless, and my house still felt so far away. For a second, I actually considered it. But my parents' warnings about strangers were drilled into my head. Even so, I was too shy and flustered to just say no and walk away. I was frozen. All I could manage to get out was a quiet, confused, "What?" The man chuckled, still smiling. "A ride," he repeated, a little slower this time, as if I were simple. "Do you want a ride home?" As he said it, the man in the back seat behind him started to open his door, a clear invitation for me to get in. He was grinning at me too. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I was just an 8-year-old kid, overwhelmed and embarrassed. I just stood there, clutching the straps of my backpack, and said again, "What?" All 3 of them let out a small, shared chuckle, as if my confusion was the funniest thing in the world. The man in the passenger seat leaned a little further out the window, his smile starting to look less friendly and more like a mask. "Dude, you want a ride?" he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. At that exact moment, the silence was broken by another sound. The loud, rusty squeak of a screen door opening from one of the few occupied houses on the street. I glanced over and saw Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who I knew from church, standing on her porch, holding a small watering can. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching us. Looking back, I know she did it on purpose. She saw this sketchy scene playing out and wanted to let these men know that I wasn't alone, that there was a witness. I turned my gaze back to the car. The mood had completely changed. None of them were smiling anymore. Their faces were hard. their eyes cold and annoyed. The man in the passenger seat dropped the friendly act entirely. His voice was a low, abrupt command. "Get in the car," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an order. I felt a jolt of real fear then. The air grew thick with a sense of urgency, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I was completely on the spot, and my nervous brain defaulted to its only response. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I heard the screen door on Mrs. Peterson's porch slam shut. She was now standing at the edge of her porch, arms crossed, making her presence even more obvious. The men in the car all glanced over at her. The driver muttered something I couldn't hear. The man in the passenger seat shot me a look of pure frustration. "Forget it," he snapped. The guy in the back slammed his door shut, and the car sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the street. Still oblivious to the true gravity of what had just happened, my first thought was, dang it, I could have gotten a ride home. It's terrifying to think about that now. I turned and looked at Mrs. Peterson. She gave me a soft, gentle smile and a little nod. I managed a shy smile back before turning and continuing my walk home. It was only years later, as a teenager, that I fully understood what had likely been about to happen. I wasn't just being offered a ride. I was being lured. That elderly woman on her porch didn't just witness a sketchy scene. She very likely saved my life. I was so close to willingly getting into that car, and if she hadn't been there, who knows what those men would have done when their patience finally ran out. The thought still gives me chills. So to that kind old woman, thank you. And to the three strangers in that black car, I am so glad we never met again. My stepdad, Rick, came into our lives during my junior year of high school. My parents had divorced when I was little, and I was used to my mom dating. I was happy for her when she met someone new, but that feeling evaporated the moment I met him. Rick was originally from Florida and had moved to our town in Indiana right before he met my mom, leaving an ex-wife and a son behind. From day one, I had a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach about him. He was a weirdo in every sense of the word. He was argumentative, always trying to start fights over the most petty things. He would walk around the house shirtless, showing off the strange double-hoop nipple rings he had, even when my friends were over. He was strange, but he was never threatening or abusive towards my mom or me. Not until the night before my mom's birthday. I remember that night with perfect, terrifying clarity. It was a Friday, and I was waiting for my best friend to pick me up so we could go out for a birthday dinner. My mom and Rick also had plans to go to a bar and watch a basketball game. My mom, being the protective person she is, wanted to wait until my friend arrived and I was safely gone before she left with Rick. For some reason, this simple request sent Rick into a rage. He started yelling about how she cared more about me than him, stormed out of the house, and drove off without her. I left with my friend shortly after, feeling a sense of unease. I got home around 11 p.m. Rick still wasn't back. My mom was acting strange and nervous. When I asked about him, she just brushed it off and told me to go to bed. I fell asleep, but I was woken up sometime later by my mom screaming my name. I was groggy and disoriented, fumbling for my phone on the nightstand, thinking I had overslept and was late for school. I checked the time. It was almost midnight. "Lock your door. Call 911. My mom screamed again, her voice raw with terror. That's when everything exploded. I leaped out of bed and slammed my bedroom door shut, fumbling with the lock just as 3 gunshots ripped through the wood, missing me by inches. Splinters flew across the room. I screamed and scrambled to the far side of my bed, dropping to the floor and crawling behind it, hoping to be shielded from any more bullets. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the numbers. I barely had time to sob my address to the dispatcher before I heard my mom let out one last horrible scream, followed by 2 more gunshots. Then, silence. A dead, heavy silence that felt like the end of the world. A horrible certainty washed over me. He had just murdered my mom. I was still huddled behind my bed when I heard him start throwing his body against my locked door, trying to break it down. Thump, thump, thump. All I could think about was getting to my mom, but I was frozen with fear. With a final splintering crash, the door flew open. It was Rick. His eyes were wide and glazed over, like he was looking right through me. He lunged across the room, grabbed me by the collar of my pajama shirt, and pressed the cold metal barrel of the gun to my temple. "Is this what you wanted?" He hissed, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Is this what you wanted?" I screamed and fought back, a surge of adrenaline I've never felt before or since pumping through me. The next few moments are a blur. I somehow managed to get my hands on his wrist and push the gun away from my head. I pushed him with all my might, and he stumbled backward, falling onto my bed. I used both of my hands to hold his arm down, the one with the gun, as we struggled on the mattress. Then, my mom appeared in the doorway. She was covered in blood. There was a gunshot wound in her neck and another in her stomach. She stumbled into the room, collapsed across Rick's body, and laid her own body over the gun, pinning it between them. "Run," she whispered to me, her voice weak. "Run." I ran. I flew out of my room, out the front door, and up the street to my neighbor's house, screaming hysterically. I pounded on their door until they opened it, and they pulled me inside, their faces a mask of horror. I was able to redial 911 and tell them what was happening. While I was at my neighbor's, my mom was still in my room with Rick. She told me later that she was getting weak from blood loss and rolled off of him onto the floor. She asked him why he was doing this. He didn't answer. He just put the gun in his own mouth. In that moment of distraction, she took the opportunity to crawl out of the room and out the front door, right into the arms of the first police officer who arrived on the scene. The police ended up in an hours-long standoff with Rick, who had barricaded himself inside the house. It ended when he made the mistake of pointing his gun at them through a window. They shot him. He survived and is now serving a 45-year prison sentence. To this day, he has never given a reason for what he did. Honestly, I don't care what his reason was. My mom and I both lived. We've grown closer through the trauma, and we even got matching tattoos. They say, strength comes from the madness we survive. This happened just this morning. I'm a full-time student, and I also work a full-time job at a coffee shop, so my life is usually a frantic mess. But my university classes just ended for the semester, and most of the students have gone home for the holidays. This means work has been incredibly slow. It's been a much-needed break for my mental health. I usually only smoke weed when my ulcerative colitis is flaring up, but I found myself with a rare 9 to 5, Monday to Friday schedule this week and the entire weekend off. I was recovering from a mild hangover, and I figured, why not? I could smoke a little, play some video games, and still be functional by lunchtime. I have nothing to do today, no one to see. It's fine. I rolled a joint, slid open the glass door to our apartment's small balcony, and smoked. It was peaceful. I was the only one awake in my apartment. My fiancée and our roommate, Linda, were still asleep. After a few minutes, I slid the door shut, wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch, and got ready to lose myself in some PlayStation. Suddenly, there were 3 quick, hurried knocks at my front door. I bolted upright, my heart jumping. Crap, did I forget someone was coming over? I thought, my high-induced paranoia kicking in. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. I saw a middle-aged man. He had thinning, Homer Simpson-style hair, transition lenses that were dark even in the dim hallway, and he was holding a handful of presents wrapped in cheap gold-colored paper. He was messing around on his phone. In the periphery, I could see that the apartment directly across the hall was getting a Domino's pizza delivered. The delivery guy was standing in their open doorway. Feeling a bit safer with an audience nearby, I opened the door. The man looked up from his phone, greeted me with a cheery, "Hello," and started to walk right into my apartment. I stood firm in the doorway, blocking his path. When he realized I wasn't moving, he stuck his hand out to shake. I shook it, my grip firm, staring him straight in the eye, still completely confused about what was happening. Keep in mind, while I was trying to look tough, I'm a pale, skinny guy. I was in my pajamas, and my eyes were definitely red and glossy. "I'm here for Linda," he said. "I'm her father." I could have sworn Linda had mentioned that her father was a tall black man. This gentleman was white and probably 5'5" at the most. "Oh, you're Linda's father," I said, making sure to say her name clearly. "Let me go get her for you. Hold on." I turned and made my way down the short hallway to her bedroom door, which is next to the room my fiancé and I share. I knocked and said there was a visitor for her. By the time I turned around, the man was right behind me in the narrow hallway, still holding his presents, still messing with his phone. I had to do that awkward slide past him thing to get by in my own apartment. I figured I'd leave them to their reunion. He seemed so excited to be there. I made my way back to the living room. Before I could even sit down, I heard Linda's muffled voice from her room, and then the man's voice, loud and clear. "No, I'm Jane's father." My blood ran cold. This guy wasn't here for my roommate. He was either completely lost or he was actively trying to get into our apartment for some other reason. I bolted up and hurried back down the hallway, half tripping over a shoe since I was still pretty high. I saw him with his hand on the doorknob to my bedroom, where my fiancée was sleeping. I got a little loud then, which is not like me at all. "Sir, you're in the wrong apartment," I said, my voice sharp. As I said this, he must have been talking to someone on his phone, because he pulled it up to his face and said into it, "I'm here, baby," and tried to ignore me, his hand still on my doorknob. "You are in the wrong unit," I repeated, much louder this time. He finally looked at me. "Who are you here for?" I demanded. "Jane in Unit 14, he said. "This is Unit 12, I told him. "Unit 14 is downstairs. I'll show you the door." I practically herded him out of my apartment. The pizza guy was still standing in the doorway across the hall, holding the pizza, looking just as confused as I felt. As I closed and locked my door, I heard the man in the hallway asking his phone what floor she was on. The whole thing had happened in less than 2 minutes. Later, my fiancée woke up. I told her the story offhandedly, and she got a strange look on her face. She asked me what he looked like. I described him. The hair, the glasses, the presence. Her face went pale. She told me that about a month ago, while I was at work, a man fitting that exact description had been banging on our door, demanding she let him in. He had been looking for a Jane then, too. He either keeps getting our unit mixed up with someone else's, or he's deliberately trying to get a look inside our apartment. Either way, it leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. Terry, or whatever your name is, let's not meet again. When I was 13, back in 2014, I met up with an old friend from elementary school named Ethan. We had drifted apart in middle school, and we had a lot to catch up on. We decided to go to a large public park that was located about halfway between our houses. We messed around on the swings for a while, but a group of younger kids started getting territorial, so we decided to leave. We walked over to the basketball court, which was near one of the park's main exits on the way to Ethan's house. This particular area of the park was notorious for being a bit sketchy. It was surrounded by a thick wall of overgrown bushes and dense trees, the kind that are easy to hide in. We weren't really paying attention to our surroundings. We were deep in conversation, laughing about old memories. We had no idea what was about to happen. We didn't notice the group of figures emerging from the trees until they were right on top of us. It happened so fast. One moment we were walking and talking, the next we were completely surrounded. There were 6 or 7 of them, all dressed in black hoodies and jeans, with ski masks covering their faces. They were armed with what looked like kitchen knives, steak knives, and small paring knives, glinting in the afternoon sun. We were frozen in shock. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. He demanded we give them all of our money and our phones. "Give us everything you have or we'll kill you," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. He said they wouldn't hesitate to stab us if we refused or tried anything stupid. Even through the mask, his voice sounded strangely familiar. As I got a better look at his build and the way he stood, a horrifying realization dawned on me. I knew who he was. It was my old best friend, Jake. We had been inseparable for years, like brothers, before he fell in with a bad crowd and we grew apart. I don't think he recognized me at first, because he pointed his knife directly at my chest and demanded our stuff again, his voice more aggressive this time. At that exact moment, Ethan must have realized it too. Simultaneously, we both said his name. Jake? He froze. He stared at us for a long, silent second. Then, he slowly reached up and pulled his mask off. A look of shock and then recognition crossed his face. "Holy crap," he said. He looked at me and said, "Man, you haven't changed much." He then turned to the other guys, who were still holding their knives out, and told them to back off. He looked back at us and said, "You guys are lucky. Now get out of here. Go." We didn't need to be told twice. We started walking away, trying not to run. As we reached the park exit, we glanced back. We saw Jake and his crew melting back into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Freaked out of our minds, we ran the rest of the way to Ethan's house and didn't leave for hours. When it was finally time for me to go home, I ran the entire way, avoiding the park completely. I saw Jake around town a few times after that, but I always avoided him. I'd pretty much stopped going out on my own for the next few years. My childhood best friend, the guy who was like a brother to me, almost mugged and possibly killed me. If he hadn't recognized who I was, I have no doubt that things would have ended very differently. The other kids with him seemed amped up and ready to do something violent, even if we had just handed everything over. Jake had screwed me over and dragged me into bad situations before, but this was on a whole other level. I know he let us go, but I can't forgive him for putting us in that position in the first place. I heard recently that he supposedly turned his life around, got a job, and cleaned up his act. But I'm done with him. I hope I never see him again. When I was in middle school, around 11 or 12, my best friend was a kid named Alex. We lived in the same sleepy suburban neighborhood in Ohio, a place with identical houses and neatly manicured lawns. Our houses were on opposite sides of the neighborhood, so most mornings, I'd walk over to his place, and we'd walk the rest of the way to school together. This was back around 2011, a time that felt safe and simple. The routine was always the same. I'd get to Alex's house, and his mom, Sarah, would let me in. Alex was never ready. He was one of those kids who moved at the speed of a sloth in the morning, so I would usually have to wait for him in the living room for a good 10 or 15 minutes while his mom hurried him and his little brother along. At first, it was totally normal. Sarah was nice enough. She was a stay-at-home mom, always dressed in yoga pants and a clean t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She'd offer me a glass of juice and make small talk about school. The house was always immaculate, smelling of laundry detergent and whatever candle was burning on the coffee table. It seemed like the perfect suburban home. After a few months of this routine, things started to get weird. It was subtle at first. Sarah started standing a little too close to me when we talked. If I was sitting on the couch, she would sit right next to me, our legs almost touching, instead of in the armchair across the room like she used to. I didn't think much of it. I was a kid, and adults were just weird sometimes. I figured she was just being friendly. Then the questions started. They began innocently enough. She'd ask about my parents, what they did for work, if they fought a lot. Then the questions became more personal, more invasive. She'd ask if my parents ever left me home alone at night. She asked me what I thought about girls, if I had a girlfriend yet. I was a shy, awkward kid, and these questions made my skin crawl. I just mumbled, "I don't know," and tried to change the subject by asking if Alex was almost ready. One morning, the weirdness escalated to a level I couldn't ignore. I was sitting on their beige sofa, staring at the TV, when she sat down next to me, closer than ever. She put her hand on my thigh. It wasn't a quick, friendly pat. She just left it there. My entire body went rigid. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming, "This is wrong. This is weird." But I was frozen. "You look tired, sweetie," she said, her voice soft and low. "Do you ever just need a nap during the day? You can always come over here and take a nap if you need to. Our guest room is very quiet." Her hand was still on my leg, her thumb stroking the denim of my jeans in slow circles. I felt sick to my stomach. "I'm okay," I managed to choke out, my eyes fixed on the blank TV screen. "My husband will be home from his business trip soon," she said, almost as a non sequitur. She said it with a strange little smile, as if it was some kind of secret she was sharing. She started saying that a lot. "My husband will be home soon." Sometimes she would say it once, sometimes a few times during my short wait for Alex. I didn't understand what it meant, but the way she said it made me feel a deep, cold sense of dread. It felt like a threat or a promise. I wasn't sure which. I was a naive kid. I didn't have the vocabulary or the understanding to process what was happening. I just knew it felt deeply wrong. I never told my parents or anyone else. How could I explain it? A mom was being weird? An adult was always right, and I was just a kid. I thought maybe I was imagining it, or that I was the one who was making it weird. I thought if I told someone, they would think I was a liar or that I had done something to cause it. The final straw came a week or so later. I was waiting for Alex, and Sarah was in the kitchen. She called me in, saying she had baked cookies. I walked into the kitchen, and she handed me one. As I took it, she cornered me between the counter and the refrigerator. She put her hands on my shoulders and leaned in close, so close I could smell the coffee on her breath. "You know," she whispered, "if you ever have any thoughts about things, sexual things, you can talk to me about them. I'm a very good listener. It's important for young men to have someone they can talk to about those feelings." I was so petrified I couldn't move or speak. All I could do was stare at the pattern on her wallpaper. It was a horrible, dizzying floral print. At that moment, I heard Alex thundering down the stairs, yelling that he was finally ready. Sarah stepped back, her expression changing in an instant from one of intense intimacy to casual, maternal warmth. "There you are, sleepyhead," she called out to Alex, as if nothing had happened. I grabbed my backpack and practically ran out of that house. I didn't say goodbye. On the walk to school, I told Alex I couldn't wait for him in the mornings anymore, that my mom wanted me to come straight home after school and go straight to school in the morning. It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of. After that day, I always walked to school alone. I've kept that secret bottled up for years. It feels good to finally get it off my chest, but it's sickening to think about an adult taking advantage of a child's innocence like that. I just pray she never did that kind of thing to any other kids. I have two stories from my childhood that still make my skin crawl when I think about them. The first one happened when I was 10 years old, on a scorching hot summer day around 2012. I was allowed to play outside in the common area in front of our apartment building, but my mom's rule was that I had to stay within sight of our kitchen window. On this particular day, it was around noon, and most of the other kids were inside having lunch or a nap. It was just me and an 8-year-old boy from my building, drawing with chalk on the hot pavement. There were plenty of people walking on the streets, but I remember noticing one man in particular. He looked to be in his late 20s, and he walked past us once, then turned around and walked past again, slowing down to look at us each time. He eventually walked off down the street, so I forgot about him and went back to my chalk drawing. Some time passed, and suddenly I saw a pair of worn-out men's sneakers standing right next to where I was crouched. I looked up, and it was the same man. He glanced around, then looked at the little boy I was with. "Hey, kid," he said, "can you go a little further away? I need to tell your friend here a secret." The boy, without questioning it, just got up and moved. I was left alone with the stranger. He was staring at me, and even though he was smiling, his eyes were intense, and there was a strange tension in his posture that made me feel a little uneasy. He crouched down, propping his hands on his knees to get to my level. I don't remember what he said at first, because I was nervously looking around to see if my mom was watching from the window. Then he asked me, "Do you like kittens?" My eyes lit up. All my uneasiness vanished. "Yes," I said, perking up immediately. "I know where a mother cat just had a whole litter of kittens," he said, his smile widening. "Do you want to come and see them?" I stood up so fast I almost fell over. All the stranger danger warnings my parents had drilled into me evaporated at the prospect of seeing newborn kittens. He told me to follow him, and I did without a second thought. He walked in front of me, leading me towards the entrance of one of the adjacent apartment buildings. Back then, the main doors to these buildings weren't locked, and neither were the doors to the basement areas, which were located just inside the main entrance. He went into the building and immediately started heading down the dark concrete staircase that led to the basement. That's when some kind of self-preservation instinct finally kicked in. I hesitated at the doorway. He was already at the bottom of the stairs when he turned to see if I was following. "Come on, hurry up," he called out cheerfully. "Let's go." I took a few hesitant steps inside. The air was cool and damp and smelled of mold. He continued further down the basement corridor, where it was pitch black. I could only see half of him as he turned a corner. Then I heard a distinct metallic click sound. I was just starting to descend the first step when he peeked his head back around the corner. He was still smiling, but what I saw next made my blood run cold. His belt buckle was dangling, unbuckled. He stepped out a little more, and his hand moved down, drawing my eyes to his unzipped pants. He was just looking at me with this horrible, expectant expression. I wanted to scream, but I was so shocked I couldn't make a sound. It was a true deer in the headlights moment. He took one step towards me, and that's what finally broke the spell. A sudden jolt of adrenaline shot through me. One moment, I was frozen on the stairs, and the next, I was sprinting out of that building as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't even turn to see if he was following. I just ran. I ran all the way to my own building and up the stairs to my apartment, nearly crashing into my very worried mom, who was just putting on her shoes to come look for me. She said she had peeked out the window and couldn't see me, and a bad feeling had washed over her. She asked me what happened, and at first, I didn't tell her. I was ashamed and scared she would be angry that I had talked to a stranger, let alone followed him into a basement. But I couldn't stop shaking, and eventually, I told her everything. Needless to say, I got a long lecture and wasn't allowed to play outside without an adult supervising for a very long time after that. The second story happened when I was 12. It was during spring break, and my mom, my aunt, my 13-year-old male cousin, and I went to the big amusement park in the city. While my cousin was on the bumper cars, I was sitting on a bench with my mom and aunt when I saw a man setting up a big tin pot at the edge of the alley leading into the park. I knew immediately what he was selling: boiled corn on the cob. My mom gave me some money, and I headed over to him, my mouth already watering. When I got there and ordered 4, he hesitated. He gave me a very unsettling once-over, his eyes traveling from my head to my toes and back up again. Then, without even checking his pot, he said, "I don't think I have enough in there." I thought that was weird since I had just watched him set up, but I was too shy to question him. He quickly added, "But my car is parked just over there," he said, pointing to the parking lot behind the alley. "I have another pot in my trunk. If you want, you can follow me, and we can get it." I looked back towards the park. The parking lot was close. It didn't seem like a big deal. Relieved I would get my corn after all, I followed him. He picked up his pot and started walking towards the parking lot with me trailing a few steps behind. He had just opened the trunk of his old beat-up car to put the pot inside when my aunt suddenly grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "What are you doing?" she hissed at me before turning on the man. "What is wrong with you, asking a child to follow you to your car alone?" I caught a glimpse inside the trunk. There was no other pot of corn. It was completely empty except for the one he had just put inside. I was still confused, and honestly, a little annoyed at my aunt for overreacting, when the man's reaction confirmed everything. Instead of explaining himself or trying to make an excuse, he slammed the trunk shut, jumped into the driver's seat, and peeled out of the parking lot so fast that his tires screamed. My aunt and I just stood there, dumbfounded. The innocent situation had turned into a very real potential kidnapping attempt. My aunt told me later that she'd had a weird gut feeling from the start, because the man was dressed too nicely to be a simple street vendor. Thank God she was paying attention. Last year, I was studying abroad in Germany, living in a small town outside of Frankfurt. One afternoon, I was on the regional train heading into the city. The train was late, as usual, and I was just trying to relax and read a book. I was wearing a pretty normal outfit for a warm day, a high-waisted skirt and a crop top, with maybe an inch or two of my midriff showing. It was nothing daring or revealing. I sat down in one of those 4-seat booths, and an old man sat across from me. He was reading a book that looked like it was handwritten in Russian, which I thought was kind of interesting. He seemed harmless enough. For the first 30 minutes of the train ride, everything was peaceful. He read his book and I read mine, occasionally scrolling through my phone. As we traveled, the weather started to turn. The sky grew dark and a cold rain began to streak down the windows. After a while, the old man looked up from his book and stared out the window. Then he looked at me. His eyes widened and he started screaming and pointing out the window. It was at this point that I noticed he seemed to be missing a chunk of his face around his eye, like an old injury had healed badly. He was mostly screaming gibberish, and I was trying to understand what was happening. I looked around for help, but the other passengers were doing that classic thing where they pretend nothing is happening, staring intently at their phones or out the windows. I finally understood what he was yelling about. He thought I was the one who had brought on the bad weather. He started screaming that it was because of my shirt, that I must have the devil inside of me, because no sane, godly person would wear a crop top. I was just sitting there in shock, completely stunned. I didn't say a word. He stopped screaming for a moment and turned a few pages in his handwritten book. He reached into his pockets and pulled out 2 small wooden crosses, one for each hand. Then he held them out towards me and began performing an exorcism right there in the middle of the train car. He was chanting loudly, leaning towards me, his face contorted. He switched between what I assumed was Latin, Russian, and German. He would scream, then whisper, then his eyes would roll back in his head. It was the most surreal and terrifying thing I've ever experienced. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave the train car. It was a small train, and he would have just followed me. I debated hiding in the tiny bathroom, but I still had almost an hour left on my trip. I was afraid he would just wait outside the door for me. So I just sat there, frozen, while this man tried to exorcise the demon he believed was living inside my crop top. After what felt like an eternity, he finished. He seemed satisfied with his work. He told me that I needed to leave Germany and go to a good church in Russia for a proper blessing, because the churches in Germany were crap. I just nodded, wanting to do anything that would make him stop talking to me. He went back to reading his book for another 10 minutes. Then he pulled a laminated card out of his wallet and handed it to me. I looked at it. It had his name and photo, and underneath, in German, it said that the holder of this card was severely mentally disabled. I immediately thought he must have escaped from a facility somewhere. Just as the train was pulling into the Frankfurt station, he told me that he was going to follow me to make sure I could keep the devil out. He said he was still drawn to the evil inside me and was afraid his exorcism hadn't worked properly. "No, that isn't necessary," I said, my voice shaking. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I will find you." The second the train doors opened, I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran and ran, not even knowing where I was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between me and that man. I eventually ducked into a large shopping mall and called the friend I was supposed to be meeting. I never saw the creepy old man who performed an exorcism on me ever again. Thank God. For some context, I'm a 22-year-old woman, about 5 feet 2 inches and 125 pounds. My mom is 45, but she's tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, and looks much younger than her age. Because we're both small and tend to look young, we've had our fair share of run-ins with creeps. I'm paranoid enough that I carry a small arsenal in my purse at all times. Pepper spray, a taser, and a pocket knife. I tend to be pretty confident I can handle myself. But this one night was the worst we've ever experienced. My mother and I were doing our weekly grocery shopping at our local Walmart. It was later than we usually go, around 7 p.m., which is a time we try to avoid because that's when the creepers seem to come out. We pulled into the parking lot and started walking toward the entrance. I immediately spotted a group of 5 young men, probably in their late 20s, standing near the door, smoking and laughing loudly. I didn't pay them much mind, other than a passing glance. They glanced over at me and my mom as we walked past them and went inside to get a cart. A moment later, the same 5 men all came inside. Again, I shrugged it off but made a mental note of their faces. We headed straight for the grocery section at the back of the store. As we started shopping, I kept noticing that 2 or 3 of the 5 men were in every single aisle we went down. The first couple of times, I dismissed it as a coincidence. But by the 4th aisle, alarm bells were ringing loudly in my head. I tried to push the paranoia aside, telling myself I was overreacting. I kept my head high, making eye contact, hoping a show of confidence would put them off. It usually does. I decided to test my theory. I deliberately steered our cart down a few random aisles we didn't need anything from. The pet food aisle, then the hardware section. Sure enough, at least one of them was always there, pretending to look at products, but always watching us. My mom started to notice too. Her hand squeezed my arm in warning as she shot one of the men a death glare. We were in the cereal aisle, and one of them, a tall, lanky guy with a pointed, rat-like face under a baseball cap, had moved to stand just a couple of feet from our cart. He just glanced over at my mom's glare and smirked at her. My mom, who can be a fierce mama bear, narrowed her eyes, unnerved by his response. She shot me a worried look. I tried to act nonchalant and moved around him to grab a box of cereal. As I turned back around, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Another one of the guys was standing directly in my path, blocking me. This one was blonde with shaggy, greasy hair, wearing a gray hoodie. He was staring up at the shelves, but he had a smirk on his face. My stomach flipped. "Excuse me," I snapped, trying to go around him. He just shifted his body, blocking me again. I shot him a glare, no longer finding his little game funny. My mom, seeing what was happening, pushed the shopping cart directly between us and asked loudly if I was ready to go. The guy finally took the hint and moved, but not before smiling at us, showing a row of yellowed teeth. This continued for our entire shopping trip. In every aisle, there they were. By the time we finished getting our groceries, I was terrified they were going to follow us out to the parking lot. So, we started roaming all over the store, taking bizarre routes through the clothing sections, the electronics, the garden center. After about 20 minutes of this, we seemed to have lost them. We both relaxed, figuring they had given up and left. We headed to the self-checkout lines. Just as we were halfway through unloading our cart, I got that hair standing on end feeling again. I slowly turned my head. In the checkout lane right next to us, there they were, all 5 of them. My stomach dropped. I looked at my mom, who was staring at them with wide eyes, her face pale. They had maybe 10 items between all of them. We had a full cart. We figured they would have to finish and leave long before we did. But they didn't. They decided to go as slowly as humanly possible. For the next 15 minutes, they just stood there, watching us, occasionally scanning an item and then just waiting. My mom, now in a full-blown panic, grabbed her phone and called my dad. In her panicked state, she wandered a few feet away to talk to him, which she later admitted was not her best moment. I turned back to scan the last few items. The rat-faced guy in the ball cap was suddenly standing right next to me at my register. We stared at each other. He was grinning, showing his gross, stained teeth. I just glared back, my hand gripping a package of chicken so hard my knuckles were white. Without breaking eye contact, he took an empty soda bottle he'd been holding and tossed it into our nearly full trash can, even though the trash can at his register was completely empty. Then he turned and went back to his friends. My mom hurried back over, her phone call finished. My dad had told her to go to customer service and ask for a security guard to walk us to our car. As we paid and got our receipt, the 5 men finally left. We rushed over to the customer service desk. The women there were amazing. They saw the fear on our faces and immediately called security. A big, calm security guard came over, took our descriptions, and went to check both of the store entrances. When he came back, he told us that he had found 5 men matching their descriptions hiding around the corner of the building, just out of sight of the main doors. He said the minute they saw his uniform, they took off running. He walked us all the way to our car, making sure we were safely inside and locked up before he left. We never saw those men again, but I can't shake the feeling of being hunted through that store. I grew up in a quiet cookie-cutter cul-de-sac in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of place where all the houses looked the same, all the lawns were perfectly manicured, and nothing interesting ever happened. My next-door neighbor was an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy. He was a widower who had lived in that house for over 40 years. He was the quintessential sweet old man. He'd always wave to me when I was outside. He gave out the best candy on Halloween, and his garden was the most beautiful on the block, full of prize-winning roses. My bedroom window looked directly out onto the side of his house and his backyard. I spent a lot of time in my room, and over the years, I became an unwitting observer of Mr. Abernathy's daily routines. I saw him get the paper every morning at 6 sharp. I saw him spend hours in his garden every afternoon. It was all very normal, very predictable. When I was around 16 in 2019, I started noticing some odd things. Mr. Abernathy had a small locked shed at the very back of his perfectly manicured yard. I had never seen him go into it. But one night, I was up late studying, and I saw a light on in the shed. I thought it was strange, but I figured he was just getting a tool or something. But he was in there for over an hour. This started happening regularly, always late at night, a couple of times a week. Then came the bags. Every Tuesday night, like clockwork, Mr. Abernathy would drag his large rolling trash bin to the curb for the Wednesday morning pickup. But I started noticing that on the nights he spent time in his shed, he would carry out an extra bag. It was always a thick, black, industrial-looking trash bag, and it always seemed to be very heavy. He would carefully place it at the very bottom of his bin, then pile his regular kitchen trash on top of it. It just seemed secretive. My curiosity got the better of me. I started paying closer attention. One afternoon, I saw him in his garden, but he wasn't tending to his roses. He was digging a hole. A deep, narrow hole, right in the middle of his prize-winning rose bed. A few hours later, he came out of his house carrying something wrapped in a small blanket. He placed it gently in the hole and filled it back in, carefully tamping down the dirt. Over the next few days, he planted a new rose bush directly on top of that spot. A few weeks later, a family down the street reported that their cat, a fluffy Persian named Princess, had gone missing. They put up flyers all over the neighborhood. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. I remembered the small blanket-wrapped bundle Mr. Abernathy had buried. My fear and suspicion grew. I started watching him more intently. I noticed that on the nights he went to his shed, he would leave his back porch light on. I started to realize that this was a signal. Stray cats from all over the neighborhood were drawn to his yard. He would leave out bowls of food for them. I thought it was sweet at first, another example of the kind old man. But then I saw it. One night, through my window, I saw him coaxing a small tabby cat onto his porch. He was petting it, talking to it in a soft, gentle voice. The cat was purring, rubbing against his legs. Then, with a sudden, swift movement, He grabbed the cat by the scruff of its neck, and in his other hand was a small, clinical-looking syringe. He quickly and efficiently injected the cat with the contents of the syringe. The cat went limp in his arms. He then carried the lifeless body into his shed. I felt like I was going to be sick. The sweet old man next door, the one who gave out candy and grew beautiful roses, was a serial cat killer. The black bags, the late-night trips to the shed, the burials in his garden, it all made a horrifying kind of sense. His prize-winning roses were likely so lush because they were fertilized with the bodies of dozens of missing neighborhood pets. I didn't know what to do. Who would believe me? A 16-year-old kid accusing the beloved neighborhood grandpa of something so monstrous? I was terrified of him. I started having nightmares about him. I would see him standing in his yard at night, just staring at my window. I finally broke down and told my parents. At first, they were skeptical, but I was so hysterical and insistent that they agreed to call the non-emergency police line and report it as a suspicion, anonymously. I don't know what the police did, if they ever even talked to him. But a few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Mr. Abernathy's front yard. He moved out a month after that. We never found out what really happened, and no one ever proved anything. But every time I see an old man with a beautiful garden, a cold chill runs down my spine, and I think about what might be buried beneath the flowers. When I was about 12 years old, my dad took me back to the doctor to have the stitches from a playground fall removed from the back of my head. I sat perfectly still for the doctor, trying my best to be brave. So as a reward, my dad got me an ice cream cone and took me to a popular local swimming spot for the afternoon. It was a small town in southern Illinois, and in the middle of summer, the old limestone quarry was the place to be. It was a huge, deep pit filled with clear, cold water, surrounded by flat rocks where people would lay out their towels. Even though it was a weekday, the quarry was pretty crowded. There were families with little kids splashing in the shallows, and teenagers daring each other to jump off the higher ledges. My dad walked me down to the water's edge. He pointed a stern finger at me and said, "Stay in the shallow water where you can stand, Alex. Do not go in any deeper than your waist. Understood?" Then he said he had to make a phone call for work and disappear back towards the parking lot. I know that looks bad, but he wasn't a neglectful father, just a bit absent-minded sometimes. I was wading in the knee-deep water, enjoying the cold shock of it on a hot day, when I noticed an older boy, maybe 15 or 16, paddling around a few yards away. He was with a group of other kids, but he slowly broke away from them and came closer to me, a bright, friendly smile on his face. He had blonde hair that was bleached almost white by the sun. He asked me what my name and age were. I told him, and then, wanting to impress him, I launched into the whole story about my trip to the doctor that morning, emphasizing how brave I had been while getting my stitches out. My story seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and asked why I wasn't coming out to swim in the deeper water with everyone else. I explained that my dad had told me not to, that I wasn't a very strong swimmer yet, and I would get in big trouble. He just smiled wider. "You can't get in trouble if I'm with you," he assured me. "I can teach you how to swim better. Besides, your dad isn't even here to see." When I still looked hesitant, he added, with a little playful smirk, "What, are you scared? I thought you were supposed to be so brave. Prove it." That was all it took. The challenge to my bravery was something my 12-year-old ego couldn't ignore. I followed him out into the deeper water, my feet kicking frantically as the rocky bottom sloped away beneath me. We went out until my feet couldn't touch the bottom at all. Then, without any warning, his friendly demeanor vanished. He grabbed my shoulders and shoved me under the water. The shock of it, the sudden, inexplicable violence, stunned me. I opened my mouth to shout, but only a torrent of cold water rushed in. I struggled, kicking and clawing at him, but he was much older and stronger than me. He held me down with an unnerving, casual strength, his face just a blurry shape above the shimmering surface of the water. I realized now that he had taken me out there on purpose, away from the splashing and shouting of the other kids, where no one would notice what he was doing. Drowning an unattended young child could so easily be passed off as a tragic accident. My lungs were on fire. Black spots started to dance in my vision. I was moments away from losing consciousness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he let go. My dad had lifted me out of the water, holding me under my arms. I can still see the look on his face, a mixture of bewilderment, absolute terror, and a white-hot rage that I had never seen before. For what felt like a very long time, he just held me over his shoulder, patting my back while I coughed, sobbed, and choked up water. By the time I had calmed down enough to speak, and my dad was satisfied that I was okay, the blonde-haired boy and his friends were long gone. My dad was frantic. He drove us around the small town for almost an hour, looking for them, his knuckles wide on the steering wheel. I have no doubt in my mind that if my dad had found that kid, he would have killed him. We never saw him again, but the memory of being held under the water, the feeling of my life being in the hands of a smiling stranger who decided, for no reason at all, to try and take it away, has never left me. Around 1st or 2nd grade, I became friends with a kid named Stan. He was a couple of years older than me, but he had a younger sister who was my age and in my class, so we all hung out together. I also had a massive crush on their oldest brother, James. I was that classic annoying little girl who would chase the poor, uninterested older boy all around the playground. I lost contact with all three of them when my family moved to a different middle school district. Fast forward to the late 2010s, when Facebook was everything. I started getting back in touch with a lot of people I had gone to elementary school with. It was a small K-8 school, so we were basically with the same group of kids for 9 years. Because of this, I was always really excited when I got back in touch with old classmates. However, not all of these reconnections were positive. One day, I got a friend request from Stan. He was using a slightly different name, but I recognized his profile picture. The initial messages were the typical, "Hey, how's it going? What have you been up to?" stuff. Then, the messages started to get weird. They shifted to being about my looks. They weren't obscene, but they were overly complimentary in a way that made me uncomfortable. He immediately started pushing to meet up. I can't explain it, but I just had a really off feeling about him. So I kept making excuses and avoiding making any concrete plans. He continued to be pushy about it, and finally, I just stopped responding to his messages. I should also mention that the day I accepted his friend request, he went through literally every single one of my profile pictures, going back years, and liked them all. That should have been my first clue, but I just brushed it off as him being a bit weird. Then I started getting messages from my friends, and even some of my family members, asking me about him. Stan was going through my friends list and sending friend requests to everyone on it. At this point, I was thinking, okay, this is definitely creepy. But things got really nuts when my cousin messaged me. She told me that Stan had not only tried to friend her, but he had also sent her a message asking all sorts of questions about me. What kind of things I liked, what my hobbies were, and what places I liked to hang out. My cousin was worried that he was sending these kinds of messages to people who might actually tell him what he wanted to know. I debated sending Stan a message telling him to back off, but I decided it was better just to block him and change all my Facebook settings to make my profile as private as possible. I also sent a mass message to all my friends and family, explaining the situation and kindly asking them not to give out any of my personal information to him. I was also friends with his older brother, James, but I ended up blocking him as well, just to be safe and prevent Stan from having any possible access to my page. Things were quiet for about a week. Then the friend requests from random, fake-looking accounts started coming in. Some had no profile pictures, some had random images of cars or landscapes. They were always accompanied by messages that made it clear they were all from Stan. They were full of skeevy comments about my looks and how much he wanted to hook up. And that's putting it mildly. Every single day, I had at least one new fake account to block. I tried contacting Facebook about the harassment, but that didn't really help. It finally came to a stop when I sent a message to one of his new profiles threatening him with police intervention. My boyfriend at the time also sent him a very colorfully worded threat, and that seemed to do the trick. The peace lasted for about a year. Then, I got a friend request from a girl I had also gone to school with named Kelsey. We started talking pretty frequently, both online and over the phone. She kept pushing for us to hang out so we could catch up, but she was always suggesting odd times and places. I started to get that same weird, uneasy feeling again, that something wasn't right. Then came the bombshell. Kelsey let it slip that she and Stan were dating. The fact that they knew each other wasn't strange, but them dating felt like too much of a coincidence. I confronted her about it, asking if she was talking to me on his behalf. She got defensive, and I ended up blocking her. But because we had talked on the phone, they both now had my phone number. They began calling and texting me non-stop with crazy, harassing messages. I finally had to change my number to get them to stop. It's been over 10 years since all of this happened, and I haven't heard from Stan since. Kelsey did try to friend me on Facebook again recently with a new account. I looked through her profile, and it showed that she's now married to another man, and there was no evidence of Stan anywhere. I considered accepting, thinking maybe she was free of him and wanted to apologize. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm not taking any more chances. I'm a junior in high school now, but this all started last year when I was a sophomore. I live in a rural part of eastern Washington, where the towns are small and the houses are far apart. My day starts and ends on a long, rumbling school bus ride that winds through miles of farmland and dusty side roads. You get to know the faces on your bus, even if you never learn their names. Last year, the district changed the bus routes, and I ended up on a new one. It was a blessing at first. My old bus was always chaotic, packed with loud kids. This one was quiet, almost empty. There were only two other high schoolers, a girl named Becca and a guy named Dylan, and a handful of middle schoolers who got on about halfway through the route. For the first time in years, I could actually hear my own thoughts on the way to and from school. I'm a pretty quiet, anxious person by nature, so I treasured that peace. I usually sat in the back, listening to music on my cheap earbuds and watching the wheat fields blur past my window. Dylan sat across from me. He was one of those kids who seemed to exist in a permanent state of agitation. He was skinny and pale, with a curtain of greasy black hair that he was constantly pushing out of his eyes. He twitched a lot. For the first couple of weeks, he just kept to himself, staring out the window or at the floor. Then he started trying to talk to me. It began with simple, weird questions. "What's your favorite kind of knife?" He asked me one day, out of the blue. I mumbled that I didn't know and turned up my music. A few days later, it was, "If you had to kill someone, how would you do it?" I just ignored him completely that time, but a cold feeling was starting to settle in my stomach every time I got on the bus. Things got worse as the year went on. He started making loud, offensive jokes, not to anyone in particular, but for the benefit of the whole bus. He'd make racist comments about the migrant workers we'd see in the fields. He started talking about how he was a true patriot and how he admired historical figures who weren't afraid to cleanse society. Becca and I would just exchange nervous glances. The bus driver, a tired-looking woman named Carol, who was close to retirement, never seemed to hear him, or maybe she just chose not to. Then came the spring sports season. Becca was on the softball team, and Dylan was in track. Suddenly, they weren't on the afternoon bus anymore. That left just me. For the first 25 minutes of the ride home, from the high school to the middle school where the younger kids got on, I was completely alone with him. The first day, it was just the two of us. The atmosphere on the bus changed completely. The quiet I had once treasured now felt heavy and threatening. He moved from his seat across the aisle to the one directly behind me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head. He started making low grunting noises. Then he started whispering my name over and over again. Jessica, Jessica. It was a low, rhythmic chant that went on for miles. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for the middle school to appear over the next hill. The next day, he sat right next to me. The entire back of the bus was empty, but he chose the seat right beside me. I was pressed up against the window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He didn't say anything, just sat there, twitching and breathing heavily through his mouth. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed clothes was overwhelming. I started sitting at the very front of the bus after that, right behind Carol. I hoped the proximity to an adult would deter him. It didn't. He would sit in the seat right behind me and kick the back of my seat, lightly at first, then harder and harder until Carol would glance in the rearview mirror and tell him to knock it off. One afternoon, he leaned forward and whispered right in my ear, "I know where you live. I see you get off at the last stop." All alone out there. That was it. I was terrified. The last stop was my stop. Our house was a quarter-mile down a long gravel driveway, surrounded by fields. No other houses were in sight. He was right. I was all alone out there. Now it's this year, and my worst fears were realized. I'm on the same bus. Dylan is on it too. But now his older brother, a senior who was held back a year and has a reputation for being genuinely violent, is on the bus with him. The two of them have claimed the entire back of the bus as their kingdom. Their conversations are loud and disturbing, always about fighting, hurting animals, or the weapons they were trying to buy online. The targeted harassment has escalated. A few weeks ago, he accidentally spilled a full bottle of sticky orange soda all over my backpack. Last week, as I was getting off the bus, he threw a rock that hit the side of my head. It didn't break the skin, but it left a painful, throbbing lump. I told my parents, and they called the school, but the administration said that without clear proof, it was just one kid's word against another's. Every single day, I have to ride that bus. Every day, I have to walk past them, feeling their eyes on me. And every afternoon, when the bus pulls up to my driveway for the last stop, I get off and walk that long, lonely quarter mile, my back tingling with the fear that one day they won't stay on the bus. I'm scared that one day they'll decide to get off with me. I've been living in a suburb of Paris for the last 8 months for a study abroad program, and I've gotten pretty comfortable navigating the city on my own. One night, I was coming home from a club with some friends and had to catch the first train of the morning that went back to my town. This was around 5:30 and I was pretty drunk, exhausted, and just wanted to crawl into my bed. I was wearing a typical going out outfit, nothing crazy, just a nice top and a skirt. There was a guy on the platform who tried to talk to me as I waited. I tried to ignore him and walk down the platform to get into a different train car, but I didn't make it in time before the doors closed. There were only 2 open seats left in the car, so I sat in one. Of course, he sat in the one directly across from me. He immediately started in on me. "I want to marry you," he said, his eyes wide and intense. "I don't even want to sleep with you. I just want to be your one and only. Please, will you do me the pleasure of becoming my wife?" As he was saying all this, he leaned forward and started stroking my thigh. I was genuinely uncomfortable and tried to shrink down in my seat. "No," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'm not interested. I have a boyfriend." This was true. He scoffed. "If you had a boyfriend, he would be here with you, taking you home. My boyfriend lives 5 hours away, near the border of France and Germany, so I explained this to him. "He's not a good boyfriend then," the man said, "to leave you here all alone." He then launched into a speech about how he was a nice guy, how he had money, and how he wanted to take care of me. I told him again that I wasn't interested. Thankfully, my stop arrived. I got up to leave, and he followed me off the train. I begged him to stop, to leave me alone, but he just kept talking, walking right beside me. The morning air was cold, and I started shivering because I hadn't brought a jacket. He saw this, and before I could react, he took off his own jacket and forcibly put it over my shoulders. "You're not feeling well," he said. "I'll walk you home." I begged him not to. He started trying to talk to other people on the street, trying to get them on his side, telling them he was just trying to help a poor girl who was cold and alone. We reached a bus stop where a woman was waiting. She had been in our train car and had seen how uncomfortable I was. The man and I both started explaining our sides to her. This went on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, the woman looked at him and said, "Since you're not her boyfriend, you can't walk her home. I will do it." I was so incredibly thankful. We left the man standing there, and she walked with me for a few blocks until her bus arrived. I thought I was finally safe, that the nightmare was over. Sadly, I was wrong. My apartment is about a 10-minute walk from the train station. I was about halfway there when I heard a whistle from behind me. I turned, and my heart sank. It was the creep. He ran up to me, out of breath, and started right back in, begging for my number, telling me we were meant to be. He did this while reaching out and caressing my face. I slapped his hand away. "If you don't stop touching me, I'm going to hurt you," I said, my voice shaking with anger and fear. He continued to harass me, stepping in front of me, blocking my path. That's when I finally snapped. I pulled out my phone and threatened to call the police. Only then did his demeanor change. He looked scared, and he finally scampered off into the darkness. I finally made it home around 7:30 a.m. and just broke down crying. I'm glad nothing worse happened, but I wish that man had just taken no for an answer and left me alone. This is something that happened when I was in elementary school, around 10 or 11 years old, that I found incredibly creepy at the time, and still gives me a great deal of anxiety to think about. I had a friend named Chloe who was a year younger than me. We met at our school's after-school club, and we became really good friends, spending a lot of time together both in and of school. Chloe's parents were divorced, and she lived with her mom about a 10-minute walk from my house. I went to her house, and she came to mine. It was a normal childhood friendship. It wasn't until her dad started picking her up from the after-school club that I started to feel deeply uncomfortable. Her parents took turns, and on the days it was her dad's turn, a knot of dread would form in my stomach. The first time I met him, the after-school club was about to close, and it was just me, Chloe, and one other kid left waiting. Her dad arrived, and Chloe introduced me to him. He was a tall man with curly, reddish-brown hair, and he was wearing a suit and glasses. He looked perfectly normal, professional even. But what I remember so clearly was the way he just stared at me. Chloe was rambling on about me coming over for dinner sometime, and he just stood there, completely silent, for what felt like 3 minutes, his eyes locked on me. He didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. There were a few occasions after that where her dad took us swimming at the local pool. He wouldn't swim with us. He would just sit on the benches up in the spectator area and watch. I remember that whenever I happened to look up, he would be staring directly at me. It would be easy to say he was just keeping an eye on us, making sure we were safe. But it wasn't like that. He never even smiled. It was just an intense, unnerving, unbroken stare. There was another time when he took us to a barbecue at his house. The whole time, I felt his eyes on me. Whenever I would catch his eye from across the yard, it was like he was trying to stare me down, like it was some kind of silent, intimidating challenge. The whole thing just made me so uncomfortable that I couldn't enjoy myself. One evening at our after-school club, I decided to ask Chloe what her parents thought of me. I was a kid, and I wanted to be liked. I felt sick with anxiety when she told me what her dad had said. She told me she had asked her dad if I could sleep over at his house sometime, and he had said something like, "Of course. She's a nice girl. She's very pretty." Then, Chloe told me she had asked him, "Do you fancy her, Dad?" She said that her dad just looked away and didn't answer the question. Whenever I think about this now, more than a decade later, I think about how bizarre it would be for a child to ask her father that kind of question. I don't know if she was just being a weird kid, or if she was making it up, or if she sensed something so strange in his behavior towards me that it was the only way she knew how to ask about it. Either way, after she told me that, I tried to distance myself from her and her family. I would still see her dad when he came to pick her up, and I would still feel his eyes on me, staring from across the room. I just learned to ignore it. Eventually, I ended up moving to a different school. But whenever I remember that man and his relentless, silent stare, I still get the creeps. My ex-stepdad, Martin, was a monster. He had molested me for years, and when my mom finally found out, she threw him out of the house and reported him to the police immediately. We moved to a different house, a small rental on the other side of our small Pennsylvania suburb, trying to start over. But in the town that's small, you can't really escape your past. He was acquitted in court, a technicality, a lack of evidence, the usual garbage. But I know my mom told him in no uncertain terms that if he ever came near me again, she would kill him herself. About a year after the whole court drama, I was 14 and had just started dating my first boyfriend, a sweet guy named Kyle. He didn't know about my past with Martin. We had just met, and I was desperate to be a normal girl for once, not the damaged girl with the dark past. One Saturday afternoon, my mom was at work. I was at home with Kyle, sitting in the living room of our new house. It was his first time visiting, and we were just nervously watching a movie, that awkward teenage energy filling the room. It felt normal, and I was happy. Then the doorbell rang. Living in a quiet suburb, I didn't think twice about who it might be. I ran to the door and opened it without looking through the peephole. And there he was, Martin, just standing there on my front porch, smiling. My blood ran cold. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to slam the door, lock it, and call the police. But I was frozen. I was 14, but in his presence, I was a scared little kid again. He had this dead predatory stare that always made me feel like he could do anything he wanted, that locks and doors were just suggestions he could ignore. He was holding a big black duffel bag. My first panicked thought was that he had brought weapons, that he was here to kill me, but he just held the bag out to me. I was cleaning out the garage and found some of you and your mom's old magazines, he said, his voice sickeningly calm. I thought you'd want them back. I was freaking out on the inside. My mind was racing. He knew my mom wasn't home. He would never, ever have shown his face here if she was. He had been watching the house. He knew I was alone. Or at least, he thought I was. I took the heavy bag from him, my hand shaking. Thanks. Bye, I mumbled, and I started to close the door. He put his foot in the doorway, stopping it. He pushed the door open a little wider and looked past me into the house, that creepy, leering smile spreading across his face again. So, he said, his eyes scanning the entryway, what are you up to today? Again, I know I should have screamed for Kyle. I should have yelled for him to call the police, but I was so embarrassed. I didn't want my new boyfriend, this normal, happy guy, to be dragged into the ugliness of my life. I didn't want him to see me as a victim. I didn't want him to dump me. So instead, I went into my own kind of combat mode. I took a step forward, closer to him, making myself bigger. I looked him straight in the eye. I'm with my boyfriend, I said, my voice much stronger than I felt. I pointed to Kyle's pair of beat-up vans sitting by the door. He's right in the living room. The change in his face was instantaneous and terrifying. I had never seen that look on his face before, but I knew exactly what it meant. It was the look of a predator whose hunt has just been ruined. The creepy smile vanished. It was like a light switched off behind his eyes, leaving them cold and empty. He had a plan, some horrible, creepy plan for me that afternoon, and I had just destroyed it with 2 words. My boyfriend. I don't even remember what he said after that. He mumbled something, took his foot out of the doorway, and just sort of backed away awkwardly. I slammed the door and locked every lock on it. I leaned against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. After Kyle left, I opened the duffel bag. It was filled with old magazines, just like he said, but they weren't ours. They were all his old issues of car magazines and hunting magazines. It was just an excuse, a prop, a reason to get me to open the door. I called my mom at work straight away and told her what happened. She came home immediately and called him, screaming at him over the phone for what felt like an hour. I never saw or heard from Martin again after that day, but I can't shake the thought of what he would have done to me if Kyle hadn't been there. That look on his face when I told him I wasn't alone, it showed me everything. It showed me what he had planned and just how close I came to it. When I was 14, I was desperate to be popular. I went to a high school about 30 miles from my home, so I didn't have a neighborhood friend group. My social life revolved entirely around school. So, when I finally got invited to a sleepover at the house of a girl named Jessica, I was ecstatic. Jessica was one of the most popular girls in our grade. She was pretty, confident, and all the boys liked her. I thought this sleepover was my chance to finally cement myself in the cool group. I should preface this by saying that my parents had never met Jessica's parents when they agreed to let me stay over. This is a mistake I will never, ever make with my own children. I got to Jessica's house, and it was huge, one of those sprawling modern houses in a wealthy suburb of Connecticut. Her mom was nice enough, but when I met her stepdad, a man I'll call Mr. Albright, I immediately felt that deep, primal sense of unease. It's a feeling I think most girls and women are equipped with, a sixth sense that helps us identify which men mean us harm. But I was 14, and popularity was the most important thing in the world to me. So, I pushed the feeling aside, told myself I was being paranoid, and tried to enjoy my night. I could already tell that Jessica and her stepdad had a strange relationship. They were far more intimate and familiar with each other than I was with my own father. The way he would put his arm around her shoulders and let his hand linger too long. The way they had inside jokes that made her uncomfortable but she would still laugh at. I couldn't explain it then, but looking back as an adult, it's horrifyingly clear that he had already been sexually abusing my friend, and had been for a long time. The most terrifying moment of the night came when Jessica left the room for a few minutes to take a phone call. Mr. Albright wasted no time. He came over to where I was sitting on the couch in their massive family room. He sat down next to me and told me how beautiful I was. "I can tell you're a fresh virgin," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. I was completely frozen, petrified. "I would very much like to be the one to take your virginity," he continued, a sickening smile on his face. "I've done it before, and the girls always enjoy it. I know you would enjoy it too." I can't remember exactly what I said. I think I just mumbled something about not being interested. My voice barely a whisper. My mind was a blur of panic and disgust. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a minute before Jessica, miraculously, came back into the room. You could tell by the look on her face that she knew something had just happened. She saw the look on my face. She saw where her stepdad was sitting, and her expression immediately became one of deep, painful apology, as if it were somehow her fault. I get so angry now when I think about that. I think about her, a victim herself, trying to make the situation okay for me, trying to smooth things over in her own home, which was a minefield of abuse. I spent the rest of the night on hyper alert, but he never made another advance. He mostly stayed away from us. Maybe he suddenly realized that I might actually tell my parents. But he didn't need to worry. As many times as my parents told me as a little kid to tell them if anyone ever touched me, that conversation never really evolved as I became a teenager. I stuffed the incident down deep inside, buried it under shame and fear, and never told a single soul until I met my husband many years later. I did end up moving up the social ladder at school, so I guess I got what I wanted. But I can't stand to think about that night too much, or I just get filled with rage. Rage at him for being a predator, and rage at myself for being so desperate for acceptance that I ignored the blaring alarm bells in my own head. Back in 2009, when I was about 6 years old, my mom and I lived in a sprawling, low-income apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of Cleveland. The place was called The Willows, which was a cruel joke because the only willows were long dead, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Our unit was a cramped, damp basement apartment that always smelled faintly of mildew and boiled cabbage from the upstairs neighbors. The neighborhood was rough. You'd hear sirens at all hours, and the alley behind our building was a known spot for drug deals. My mom worked 2 jobs and was constantly exhausted, so our world was mostly just the 2 of us against everything else. The one thing our apartment had that others didn't was a massive, neglected patch of land behind it that was supposed to be a communal yard. It had long since been reclaimed by nature, turning into a dense jungle-like thicket of thorny bushes, gnarled trees, and weeds as tall as a grown man. People from the next street over had worn a thin, muddy path through it as a shortcut to the main road, so there was a steady stream of sketchy-looking people walking by at all hours. We knew it was used for more than just walking, because we'd sometimes find discarded heroin needles glinting in the dirt. And once, my mom found a ripped, stained piece of a mattress that had somehow gotten tangled in the branches of a tree about 15 feet up, a strange, sad monument to whatever happened there. As a kid, this backyard was the stuff of nightmares. I was convinced monsters lived in there. My bedroom window was one of those small, rectangular basement windows set high on the wall, right at ground level. From my bed, all I could see was a tangle of weeds and dirt. I hated it. From the moment we moved in, I started complaining to my mom that someone was watching me from that window when I was trying to fall asleep. I'd tell her I could see a shadow moving, or hear footsteps crunching on the dead leaves just outside. For weeks, my mom told me it was just my imagination running wild. "Leo, there's nobody out there," she'd say, her voice heavy with fatigue. "It's just the wind in the trees. Now go to sleep." I tried to believe her, but the feeling of being watched was so intense. It felt like a physical pressure on my skin. Then one night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, staring at the sliver of dark yard visible through my window, when a brilliant beam of light suddenly cut through the darkness and filled my room. It swept across the walls, over my toy box, and then settled directly on my face. I was paralyzed with fear, squinting into the blinding light. For just a second, the light source dipped, and I saw a face leaning down, peering in. I can still see it perfectly in my mind's eye. It was a man's face, gaunt and pale, with greasy dark hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his eyes that burned into my memory. They were wide, dark, and utterly empty, like 2 black holes. They stared right through me. I didn't scream. I was too scared to make a sound. I just pulled the covers over my head and laid there, trembling, until I heard the crunch of footsteps fading away. I didn't tell my mom about the flashlight at first. I was scared she wouldn't believe me, or that telling her would somehow make the man come back. But the fear was eating me alive. I started having trouble sleeping, and every little noise from outside would make me jump. Finally, I broke down and told her everything. She looked worried this time, but still chalked it up to a particularly vivid nightmare. My complaints didn't stop. I begged her to board up the window, to let me sleep on the couch, anything. After another week of me fighting sleep every single night, she finally snapped. The next morning, a Saturday, she grabbed my hand and said, "All right, Leo, that's enough. I'm going to prove to you once and for all that there's nothing out there." She dragged me out the front door and around the side of the building to the patch of ground directly beneath my bedroom window. I think she expected to show me a patch of undisturbed weeds and sent me on my way with an "I told you so." But that's not what we found. When we got there, she just stopped and stared, her hand tightening on mine. The grass and weeds directly in front of my window, in a perfect semicircle, were completely stomped down into a muddy, flattened mess. The ground was so packed down that it looked like someone had been standing there for hours, night after night. And it was only outside my window, a few feet in either direction. The undergrowth was as thick and untouched as ever. Then my mom knelt down and pointed at the window frame. There were deep, fresh scratch marks all around the edges of the cheap aluminum frame, as if someone had been trying to pry it open with a screwdriver or some other tool. My window didn't open, so it was unlikely they could have gotten in that way, but the intention was clear. My mom's face went pale. She looked horrified. She pulled me into a hug and whispered, "Oh baby, I'm so sorry. I should have listened." She started making plans to move us out of there immediately, but we were so broke. Moving wasn't an option, at least not right away. Around that same time, I had become best friends with a girl named Maya who lived in the apartment next to ours. We were both only children and the same age, so we were inseparable. We played in the dusty hallways, drew with chalk on the cracked pavement out front, and had no real sense of danger. One of our little secrets was our friendship with Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived on the first floor. She was incredibly kind and always had a stock of Hostess cakes for us. We'd knock on her door, and she'd invite us in to sit at her small kitchen table while she gave us Twinkies and Ho-Hosea. Our parents had no idea we went inside her house, but she was like a surrogate grandmother to us. One afternoon, Maya and I were playing outside when my mom yelled for me from our doorway. "Leo, let's go. We need to pick up a pizza for dinner." I said goodbye to Maya and ran to my mom. We were only gone for maybe 20 minutes, tops. The pizza place was just around the corner. When we got back, our entire street was blocked off. Red and blue lights were flashing everywhere, painting chaotic stripes on the brick buildings. There was yellow crime scene tape stretched across the entrance to our complex, and at least a dozen police cars were parked at odd angles. A news van was setting up a camera, and a helicopter was circling low overhead. We had no idea what was going on. A police officer told us to stay back, that there had been an incident. It took a while to piece together what had happened. While we were gone, a man had walked past our building and seen Maya sitting on her front steps, talking on her mom's phone. She was making funny faces and laughing, just being a kid. But this man, who had been staying with his mother in the complex for a few weeks, decided that Maya was making fun of him. He became convinced she was talking about him on the phone, laughing at him. He gets so enraged at the thought that he walked back to his mother's apartment, grabbed a large butcher knife from the kitchen, and came back with the intention of killing Maya. Because of where she was sitting on the steps, she saw him coming. She saw the knife in his hand. She bolted inside her apartment and locked herself in the bathroom, the phone still clutched in her hand. She called 911. Her mother, however, was in the kitchen preparing dinner and had no idea what was happening. The man couldn't get to Maya, so he took all of his rage out on her mom. He stabbed her over and over again. I heard later it was more than 20 times. It was a miracle, but she survived. After many surgeries and a long recovery, she made a full recovery. The story was all over the local news for the next few days. They kept showing his mugshot. One evening, I was watching the news with my mom, and his face filled the screen. A wave of ice-cold fear washed over me so intensely that I felt like I couldn't breathe. It was him. It was the man from my window. The man with the dark, empty eyes. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place a few days later. The man who had attacked Maya and her mom was Rick Gable. He was the son of the sweet old lady who gave us cakes. He had just been released from prison a month earlier for a violent assault and was staying with her. We had met him, briefly, a few weeks before. He had been there in the background, one of the times we visited Mrs. Gable. Just a silent shadow in the corner of her dimly lit apartment. I hadn't paid him any attention at the time. He was just a shape in the dark. But he had clearly taken note of us. He had been watching us ever since, and he had chosen me as his special project. We didn't end up moving. My mom figured that with Rick in jail, the immediate danger was gone, and we couldn't afford it anyway. We stayed for another year, but I never slept with my curtains open again. To this day, the sight of a basement-level window gives me a chill. And to the man who watched me sleep and tried to kill my best friend, I hope you are rotting in a cell somewhere, and I hope we never, ever meet again. I've lived in the same suburban neighborhood in Oregon my whole life. When I was a kid, around 9 or 10, I spent most of my summers riding my bike up and down the quiet, tree-lined streets. There was this one woman who lived a few blocks from me with her parents. She was an adult, maybe in her late 30s, but she had this strange, childlike air about her. I never thought much of it at first. Every time I'd ride my bike past her house, a small, neat-looking ranch-style home, I would notice her. If she wasn't already outside watering the lawn or sitting on the porch swing, she would appear at the door or a window almost as soon as I came into view. She would just stand there and watch me ride past. It was a little weird, but I was a kid, so I just shrugged it off. After a few weeks, her watching turned into her trying to talk to me. She'd call out, "Hello," or "Nice bike," as I rode by. I was a shy kid and had been taught not to talk to strangers, so I would just ignore her and pedal faster. That's when it escalated. She started following me. I'd be riding my bike on the other side of the neighborhood, and I'd look back, and there she would be, walking briskly a block or so behind me. It started to really freak me out. Why was this grown woman I didn't know following a 10-year-old boy? The final straw was when she followed me all the way back to my house. I quickly parked my bike in the garage and ran inside, but she walked right up our driveway and knocked on the front door. I peeked through the peephole and saw her standing there. She knocked again and asked if she could come inside and play. That terrified me. I stopped riding my bike around the neighborhood altogether after that. I just stayed in my own yard. Eventually, the strange behavior seemed to stop. Now I'm 16, and my mom and I still live in the same house, and she's back. It started a few months ago with a simple knock on our front door. I answered it without thinking, and there she was. I recognized her instantly, and a jolt of that old childhood fear shot through me. She just smiled a weird, vacant smile and didn't say anything. I quickly made an excuse and shut the door. But the knocking didn't stop. It became a regular thing, happening at all hours. It escalated from simple knocking to her pounding on the door with her fists, violently shaking the doorknob back and forth until it rattled in its frame. And then she started yelling. She knew our names. "Sarah, Michael!" She'd scream through the door. "Come out and say hi. I know you're in there." I have no idea how she learned our names. My mom and I have never spoken a single word to her. The only way she could know is if she asked our neighbors or maybe even our landlord, which is a deeply unsettling thought. Why couldn't she just ask us herself? One night last month, my mom was getting ready to go do laundry at the 24-hour laundromat down the street. It was around 11 p.m. She unlocked the deadbolt on the front door, then walked back into the living room where I was watching TV to grab her purse. In that short moment, the woman must have been waiting right outside because she pushed our front door open and walked right into our house. She was heading towards the living room with this determined look on her face. My mom screamed at her, "Get out! Get out of my house!" She physically pushed the woman back out the door and slammed it shut, locking the deadbolt and the chain. She had to have been hiding in the bushes by our porch, just waiting for the sound of the lock turning. My mom, shaken but determined, eventually left for the laundromat. As she was walking in, she noticed the woman was following her again, walking silently about 20 feet behind her. My mom quickened her pace and managed to get inside and slam the heavy glass door shut just before the woman reached it. The woman just stood outside, staring in, for a few minutes before wandering off into the night. While my mom was gone, I was home alone, holding down the fort. Around midnight, I heard it again, banging on the door. Of course, it was her. I crept to the peephole and looked out. I could see her, but as soon as my eye met the lens, she abruptly turned and ran away, scurrying down the street as if she somehow knew I was watching her. It's been happening almost every night since then. Last night, around 2 a.m, I was in the living room and I heard a rustling sound in the bushes in our backyard, right below the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out, and I saw her, crouching in the darkness. As soon as she saw the curtain move, she bolted, disappearing into the shadows between the houses. I think this might be happening to our neighbors too. A couple of times I've overheard them talking in their driveway about a stalker. The other day, I clearly heard my next door neighbor yell out his back door, "Go away, you crazy neighborhood stalker." I don't know why this all started up again after so many years, but it's terrifying. Living here feels like being under siege. Every knock, every rustle of leaves outside makes my heart pound. I really wish it would stop. My mother's second husband, Greg, was a master of disguise. When I was about 10 years old, my mom met him at the small evangelical church we'd started attending after we moved to a new town in eastern Tennessee. She was the new single mom in the congregation, and he was the charming, handsome drummer in the worship band. He had this boyish grin and easygoing, laid-back personality that made everyone feel comfortable. He wasn't my mom's usual type, but I think she was drawn to him because he seemed like such a fundamentally good guy. He had a steady job as a mechanic. He was good at fixing things around the house, and he made a real effort to be a friend to me. On top of that, he was a local boy, born and raised, and seemed to be friends or family with half the town. He was, on paper, perfect husband material. Then came the cracks in the facade. You see, Greg was an alcoholic. When he was courting my mom, it wasn't an issue. He was upfront about his past struggles, but insisted it was all behind him. He didn't really drink and made it clear that part of his life was over. That all changed after the wedding. Apparently, the stress of being a married man was too much for him to handle sober. I've known a lot of alcoholics in my life, but Greg was a special kind. This sweet, easygoing man would transform, seemingly overnight, into a raging, paranoid monster. He'd disappear for days at a time on epic benders. We'd eventually find him across town at his mother's house, half-dressed and completely trashed, hiding out by her fish pond with a case of cheap beer. One time, he even took her riding lawnmower into town to buy more. When he'd return, he would be the perfect picture of remorse. He'd cry, call himself scum, and beg my mom for forgiveness. But it wasn't just us he was apologizing to. It was to the good Lord above. That was the thing that always bothered me most about Greg. He always had to bring God into it. If we were having a family meeting to talk about his latest disappearing act, he would insist on leading us in a prayer first. Every time he had to explain himself, he'd talk about the long conversations he'd had with God on the matter. In Greg's world, God wasn't a source of strength or a beacon of hope. God was his personal defense attorney. No matter what kind of trouble Greg got himself into, he believed God was on his side, ready to argue his case. I truly believe he only talked about God's mercy and forgiveness because he desperately needed it from my mom and me. It was a manipulation tactic. He thought that if he brought up God's love, it would soften our hearts. We were good Christians, after all, and good Christians were supposed to forgive. That strategy actually worked for a while. My mom would soften, she would forgive, and the cycle would continue. But the novelty wore off. Every now and then he would go to an A meeting, come home claiming he was reborn and on the path to sobriety, but he never stuck with it long enough to make a difference. The marriage lasted a miserable 7 years. It was punctuated by his benders, followed by empty promises and performative repentance. My mom tried to be the supportive Christian wife for a long time, but eventually her patience wore out and was replaced by a deep, simmering resentment. Their fights were never physical, thank God, but they were ugly. They would scream at each other for hours, their voices echoing through the house. Finally, my mom had enough and ended it. The divorce was surprisingly quiet. I think they were both just exhausted and relieved for it to be over. She got the house, and he got the Chevy Trailblazer. That was that. A few months later, we heard that Greg had gotten remarried. He married a woman named Brenda, a sweet, quiet woman from our old church who had always had a massive crush on him. We were actually happy for them. We were optimistic. Maybe this was what he needed. Maybe he had really cleaned up his act. A few years passed. I was away at college, and my mom had moved to a different city with her new partner. It had been at least a year since we'd spoken to anyone from that town. One day, I got a message on Facebook from an old high school friend. "Did you hear about Greg?" it read. I rolled my eyes, already imagining what kind of trouble he'd gotten into this time. But as she told me what happened, my casual annoyance turned to horror. Greg and Brenda had been having problems, mostly about money. Brenda had recently moved out. She went back to their trailer one afternoon to pick up some of her things, and her 22-year-old niece came with her to help. They were surprised to find Greg there, sitting on the couch, drinking. An argument started, and it quickly escalated. The two women left, getting into Brenda's car to drive away. Greg, drunk and furious, jumped into his truck and sped after them. He caught up to them on a back road and slammed into Brenda's car, hitting it so hard that it flipped and rolled into a ditch. Realizing what he had done, Greg sped off to hide. Brenda was in critical condition for 4 days before she was finally stabilized. Her niece, however, died instantly at the scene. Jim was found hiding out on some farmland a few hours later and was charged with murder and a dozen other things. The town's golden boy, the charming church drummer, had finally done something that not even his divine defense attorney could get him out of. The story is awful for so many reasons, but the one detail that still chills me to the bone is the car Brenda was driving. It was a Chevy Trailblazer, the very same Chevy Trailblazer that Greg had gotten in the divorce. It was my mom's old car, the car I had learned to drive in. I can only imagine how fast he must have been going to flip it with his small pickup truck, and how blinding his rage must have been to not even hesitate. I sometimes wonder how many times my mother and I narrowly escaped a similar fate. I'm just glad he's behind bars where he can't hurt anyone else ever again. When I was about 7 years old, around 2011, I was extremely close with my grandmother. She lived a few towns over, and since my parents both worked a lot, she was a huge part of my life. We had a landline phone in our house, and my parents had a list of approved numbers taped to the wall next to it that I was allowed to call. My grandma's number was at the very top. I would call her at least once a week, usually on a Saturday morning, just to check in. I'd ask her silly kid questions like, "How was your day? How was your dog, buddy? And when are you coming to visit next?" One day, I went to dial her number, my finger tracing the familiar digits on the keypad. But I must have been in a hurry or just not paying attention, because I messed up. I pressed one wrong number. A woman answered the phone. As a 7-year-old, I didn't really register the subtle differences in an older woman's voice. I just launched into my usual script. "Hi, Grandma. It's me, Alex." The woman on the other end paused. "Oh, hello, sweetie," she said. "I was wondering who this was. Your number came up as private." "It's me," I said again, a little louder. "I'm using Mom's phone." Her voice immediately changed. It became warmer, more familiar, as if a switch had been flicked. She started talking to me as if she knew me, as if she really were my grandmother. "Of course, dear. How are you?" she asked. She started asking me questions about my day, about school. I found it a little odd when she asked how 3rd grade was going, because my real grandmother knew I was homeschooled. I corrected her. "Grandma, you know I'm homeschooled." She just laughed and said, "Oh, of course, silly me." My old brain gets so forgetful. I didn't think anything of it. This became a new routine. For the next 3 days, around the same time each afternoon, she would call our house. I'd hear the phone ring, and I'd race to answer it, excited to talk to Grandma. We would talk for half an hour or more each day. My mom had a rule that I couldn't make long-distance calls for more than 10 minutes because they were expensive. So I thought it was great that she was calling me back. It felt like our little secret. We talked about everything. She told me she used to be a teacher, which I thought was so cool. I told her about my favorite video games, the books I was reading, the names of my friends in the neighborhood. I felt like I was getting closer to my grandma than ever before. She was so interested in every little detail of my life. Then, on the 4th day, the conversation took a weird turn. Towards the end of our call, she said, "You know, Alex, my memory is just terrible these days. I've completely forgotten your address, and I was hoping to come visit you this weekend and bring you a surprise." That was it. That was the big, blaring red flag. My real grandparents knew exactly where we lived. They had been to our house 100 times. A cold, prickly feeling crawled up my spine. I suddenly felt very scared. I mumbled something about having to go and hung up the phone. My mind started racing, replaying all of our conversations. I thought about all the weirdly specific questions she had asked. Questions my real grandma would never ask. She'd asked if I had a girlfriend yet. She'd asked what my favorite parks were and which ones I visited the most often. She'd asked if my parents were usually home in the afternoons. At the time, they just seemed like friendly questions. Now, they felt sinister. The next day, she called again. My hand trembled as I picked up the phone. This time, I knew. "You're not my grandma," I said, my voice shaking. "I know you're not her, and we can't talk anymore." There was a long silence on the other end. Then her voice completely changed, dripped with a cold, syrupy sweetness. "You're such a friendly boy, Alex. It's a real shame we can't be friends anymore," she said. Then she added, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "But that's all right. I know where to find you. We'll see each other very soon." And then she hung up. I was terrified. I dropped the phone and ran to find my mom. Crying, I confessed that I thought I had been calling the wrong number and that I hoped she wouldn't ground me. I was too scared to tell her about the threats. My mom, seeing how upset I was, went to the phone. She checked the caller ID history and compared it to the number on our address book. The phone number that had been calling me was different from my grandmother's by only a single digit. It was a private, unlisted number, so it didn't appear in any phone book. My mom tried calling it back several times, but no one ever picked up. I never told my mom the full story of what that woman said to me, just that I had accidentally called the wrong number once, and that the person had been a little weird. For months after that, every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat. I would have nightmares about a strange woman showing up at our door. To the creepy lady who pretended to be my grandmother, who gathered information about me and threatened to find me, I hope I never ever hear from you again. For 2 years during college, from 2021 to 2023, I worked the night shift at a 24-hour gas station and convenience store. It was located on a lonely stretch of highway just outside of Austin, Texas. After about 2 a.m., the place would become a ghost town. I'd go hours without seeing a single customer. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights, the buzz of the coolers, and the occasional rumble of a semi-truck flying past on the highway. I spent most of my shifts reading, doing homework, and trying to stay awake. Most of the late-night customers were what you'd expect. Tired truckers, college kids on a late-night snack run, people on their way to or from the airport. But then there was him. I called him the Watcher. He first started coming in about 6 months into my job. He was a tall, unnaturally thin man, probably in his 40s, with pale skin and large, dark eyes that seemed too big for his face. He always wore the same thing, a clean, pressed, long-sleeved white button-down shirt and dark slacks, which was weirdly formal for 3 a.m. a Texas gas station. The first time he came in, he just bought a bottle of water. He paid with exact change and didn't say a word. He just stared at me the entire time, with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. After that, he started coming in every night that I worked, always between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. Always bought the same bottle of water, always paid with exact change. And he would always just stand at the counter and stare at me for the entire transaction, without blinking. I tried to be friendly at first. "Quiet night tonight," I'd say, or "How's it going?" He never responded. He would just stare, with a faint, unsettling smirk on his lips. After a few weeks of this, I just stopped trying. I would just complete the transaction in silence, trying my best not to look at him, feeling his eyes burning into me. Then his behavior started to change. He stopped coming inside. Instead, he would pull his old, beat-up sedan into the parking lot, park in the furthest, darkest spot, and just sit there in his car for hours. He would turn his engine off, and I could just see his silhouette in the driver's seat, perfectly still, facing the store. Facing me, he would just sit there from about 3 a.m. until the sun started to rise around 6 a.m. when my shift ended. Then he would start his car and drive away. I was terrified. I was alone in that glass-fronted store, a fish in a fishbowl, and he was out there, watching me. I started keeping the front doors locked after two a.m. with a sign telling customers to use the night service window. But that almost made it worse. Now he knew I was scared of him. One night, he got out of his car. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the empty parking lot and stood directly in front of the locked glass doors. He just stood there, maybe 5 feet away from me, on the other side of the glass. He didn't try the handle. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and stared at me with that same terrifying, knowing smirk. He stood there for over an hour. I was huddled behind the counter, my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the 911 button. I was too scared to even call my manager. I didn't want to take my eyes off him. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly raised his hand and pressed his palm flat against the glass, right at my eye level. He just held it there for a few minutes, his dark eyes never leaving mine. Then he turned and walked back to his car, got in, and drove away. The next day, I told my manager I couldn't work the night shift anymore. I made up an excuse about my class schedule changing. He was annoyed, but he agreed to move me to the day shift. I never worked another night shift at that gas station. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and I pass a lonely, brightly lit gas station on the side of a dark highway, I feel a cold dread creep up my spine. And I wonder if he found another girl, working another night shift to watch. My mom had a close circle of friends from her college days, and they all stayed in the same town in suburban New Jersey to raise their families. When I was about 6 years old, around 2007, it was very common for us to spend entire Saturdays at one of their houses. I was a pretty easygoing kid, a tomboy who was just as happy playing with dolls as I was roughhousing with the boys. One rainy Saturday, my mom took me over to her friend Sharon's house. Sharon had a son my age named Bryce. Another one of my mom's friends was there too, with her son Jake, who was a little older and quieter, while the adults sat upstairs in the kitchen, drinking coffee and catching up. The three of us kids were sent down to the basement to play. The basement was a kid's paradise. It was a huge, semi-finished space with concrete floors, but it was filled with toys, a big old couch, a TV with a video game console, and all sorts of random junk piled in the corners. It was dimly lit by a couple of bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, which gave the whole place a kind of secret clubhouse feel. Things started off perfectly normal. We played tag, weaving around the piles of boxes and old furniture. We wrestled on the old, dusty couch. I was used to playing with boys, so I didn't mind the rough and tumble nature of it all. We were just three kids burning off energy on a rainy day. After a while, we got tired of running around. Bryce, who was always the one to come up with new ideas, suddenly stopped and his eyes lit up. He pointed to a corner where a coil of old twine rope was lying on the floor. "I know," he exclaimed. "Let's play horses." Since I was the only girl, Bryce and Jake immediately teamed up and declared that I had to be the horse first. I didn't really want to, but I didn't want to be a bad sport, so I agreed. Bryce picked up the long piece of twine and came over to me. He looped it loosely around my neck, like it was a makeshift bridle and reins. Jake, who seemed less enthusiastic about this new game, just flopped down on the couch to watch. At first, it was fine. Bryce held the ends of the rope, and I galloped around the basement, making whinnying sounds. Bryce would shout commands. "Giddy up, horsey. Faster." It was silly. But after a couple of minutes, I noticed that Bryce had started whipping me with the ends of the rope, snapping them against my back. It didn't hurt much at first, just a light sting, but then he started doing it harder. "Ow, stop it," I said, slowing down. "That's starting to hurt." That seemed to be the wrong thing to say. It was like my complaining just encouraged him. He whipped me even harder, a wide, excited grin on his face. Annoyed and in actual pain now, I stopped completely and turned to face him. "I said stop," I yelled. "It's not funny anymore." As soon as the words left my mouth, his expression changed. The playful grin vanished and was replaced by a cold, determined look. Before I could react, he crisscrossed the ends of the rope in his hands and pulled them tight. The twine bit into the skin of my neck, cutting off my air. I gasped, but no sound came out. He started to choke me, pulling me backwards and trying to drag me to the floor. I looked over at the couch and saw Jake staring at us, his eyes wide with horror. He had jumped up from the couch, but was just standing there, frozen, too scared to say or do anything. Panic set in. I clawed at the rope around my neck, but his grip was too strong. My vision started to get dark around the edges. With the last bit of air in my lungs, I mustered all of my strength and let out a strangled, high-pitched scream. Luckily, my mom heard it. Seconds later, she was thundering down the basement stairs. As soon as Bryce saw her, he immediately dropped the rope and let me go. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air and sobbing, my neck burning. Bryce, without a moment's hesitation, smugly pointed a finger at me. She wanted me to do it, he said, his voice full of fake innocence. She made me do it. Jake, finally finding his voice, quietly protested from the background. No, she didn't. But my mom wasn't an idiot. She could see the bright red welts already forming on my neck where the rope had cut into my skin. She saw how pale and terrified I was. After making sure I was okay, my mother was absolutely infuriated. She stormed back upstairs and confronted Bryce's mother, Sharon, telling her exactly what had happened and how he had tried to lie about it with absolutely no sign of guilt. Sharon's reaction was just as chilling as her son's actions. She calmly told my mom that her child wasn't a liar and that he would never do anything so violent. She insisted that I must have made the whole thing up to get Bryce in trouble. Eventually, she told my mom that if it would make her feel better, she would walk Bryce over to our house later that evening to apologize. My mom, knowing she wouldn't get anywhere else with Sharon, agreed. That evening, Bryce and his mom showed up at our front door. We all sat in the living room. I remember Bryce had this smug, triumphant smile on his face the whole time, like he had gotten away with something. He hid halfway behind his mother while my mom scolded him, explaining what could have happened if I had passed out. At the end of it all, Sharon just shrugged and asked Bryce if he had anything to say. He just sat there, staring at me with that same smile, and let out a little giggle. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, they got up and left. There was no apology. My mom and Sharon's friendship was never the same after that day. We saw them less and less. A few years later, we heard that Bryce, now a teenager, was a full-blown drug addict and had been charged with assaulting his younger sister. And his mother, Sharon, was still defending him, still insisting that all of her children were perfectly normal angels. I really hope that one day she wakes up and sees the truth.